Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Reading Room. It is another installment of the debate dissection, and we have an amazing debate today given to us by the wonderful, the amazing Robin Webster, who did this as a suggestion, and it looks really good. So I watched a little bit of this, and I went, "Hey, this is really it's kind of emblematic of what debate should be." But first off, we have another special guest. It's Ember with an octopus. Um,
Yeah.
How are you? And your octopus game is on point as always, I think. How are you doing, Ember?
Oh, so right. It's been a busy day, but a pretty good
Mm.
day. Went and caught up a bunch of stuff with the kids. I tend to postpone Easter egg hunts until all the kids are
Oh,
together, and so we
right,
did the
right.
Easter egg hunt today. Did
Mhm.
graduation stuff, played badminton. The kids got to watch me run away from a carpenter bee who. I'm good with bees, but like when they try to land on me, it freaks me out and I have to run away.
Yeah, yeah. I had a bee sting me in the ankle, and I ended up having to like go to hospital. And I'm not even allergic to bees. I just got a sort of subdermal infection from it. So I've been very skittish about bees ever since.
Yeah, but busy getting stuff done. Did the final
Mm.
meeting for the Comic Con
Oh yeah, yeah, sure.
prior to the actual convention. It's like two
Yeah,
weeks
yeah.
away now. So yeah,
Oh,
but
nice.
everything looks set, looks good. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, good times.
Mm,
So this
fantastic.
one is Robert Sapolsky and Daniel
Yes,
Dennett.
Dan Dennett, yeah, the late great, I believe, Dan Dennett, who, was an amazing person. Actually, both of them, and Sapolsky, I believe, is a neurologist, deals with study of the brain. So it's certainly not, a couple of sort of armchair philosophers sort of arguing about it. But Daniel Dennett, he is a bit of a philosopher and author, I believe. But he's also I think he's a cognitive scientist of some sort. Like he has a degree in sort of psychology, in cognitive sort of behavioral stuff. So um, yeah, it's definitely some huge names here. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so his research is on philosophy of the mind, philosophy of science, and philosophy of biology, which is an amazing sort of, when you think philosophy, you're not really thinking, hey, biology and, evolutionary biology kind of thing. But that's what Daniel Dennett sort of specialized in, which is just amazing. Um, but he, primarily he has a PhD in philosophy. Now, Sapolsky, um, he more specializes in actual neurology. So rather than sort of um, sort of the philosophical side, he's a professor of biology and neurology. The actual sort of nuts and bolts, if you will, of thinking.
Yes.
Um, so he's a neuroendocrinologist. So he focuses on stress and neuronal degeneration, and sort of focuses on protecting neurons from disease, and sort of the actual neurology of things, which is just fascinating. But yeah, so really it's sort of philosophy against. I mean, it's not a very sort of, they're not really attacking one another a lot. They're more having a discussion that's a debate kind of thing, and the debate's over free will. So yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Sorry, I'm actually just trying to give myself time to wake up because I still feel so asleep at the moment. So just
That's
bear
very
with me.
fair. It's
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's
Mm.
Well, it's it's earlier than I like over where you are.
Yeah, yeah. I must admit I was up sort of late last night, doing a game stream. So which may not have been the wisest idea, I do concede. But it happens. It happens. Um, yeah, so I believe Sapolsky's taking the negative stance. So he's like, I mean, the most famous neurologist that I've seen argue against free will is why have I had a mental blank? Sam Harris. He argues against free will. It's just an illusion. It doesn't actually exist. Dan Dennett, I haven't seen a ton of. I've seen some of, and I believe he's one of the great speakers of our time. But I think he's taking the position that we do have free will. He's a compatibilist. So I will get this on the screen. But do you have anything to sort of share, anything before we get started on this?
Just hello, everyone joining from my premiere just now. Appreciate y'all coming on over to spend more time with us.
Okay. Get the view that I like. Yeah.
Yeah, like, subscribe, do all the things.
Yeah, that I would really appreciate it. That would be amazing. And I will wake up. Trust me. Give me 2 seconds in this, and I will be going. But and again, thank you so much for Robin Webster. Actually, I forgot to put a link in the channel, but I will do that. Let me make a note of it. Let's just get this underway. Let's take this apart, because it's not a very long debate. It's only an hour or so, but I feel like it's going to be a lot of content, a lot of meat in this.
Okay, so to start, just to start with a very subtle, nuanced stance, I think there is no free will whatsoever. I think that is abundantly clear. And on top of that, I think if people started believing that, it would be a far more humane world. This would be a very good thing. Now, looking at the fact that people very...
Well, that's interesting. So if people stopped believing there is free will, it would be a more humane world.
I'm not sure about that.
Well, I think he's talking about, and it has crossed my mind before, that the idea that if you just say, hey, people are the product of, because often we sort of say, hey, they're kind of a product of their environment, right? They grew up in a bad household, they learnt this off their parents. There was no, we take that as a mitigating factor a lot of the time, that, hey, that they grew up poor in a bad family, had a lot of, they're abused as a child, all these kind of mitigating factors. I think that if you do believe in no free will, then it may not be somebody's fault that they came out the way that they came out, that they are a serial killer or abuser or something like that. And that has crossed my mind before, but it kind of takes responsibility away for people for their actions. I don't know.
Well,
and I mean, I suppose that may be part of. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I don't know, because I think to our own decisions, right? Part of it is social, cultural programming. Part of it is genetic instinct and so forth. But maybe I'm just weird, but for me, there's always weighing the consequences. What are the possible outcomes? What are the probable outcomes? What do I think is going to happen? What will other people think about these actions? And all of these different factors, you could boil them down to equations or chemical reactions or brainwaves or whatever, but there's so many different factors involved that go into our awareness, our inner processor to make a decision. I think it's reductive to say, oh, it's just the way the person was raised,
Well, I mean, this is getting to the crux of determinism. It's kind of, well, if the whole idea behind determinism is that if you had exactly the same upbringing, exactly the same experiences, exactly the same genetics, exactly the same things happen to you, or you're the result of all these deterministic processes, you would take the same action they did. I guess that's the crux of determinism.
Sure, and I expect that's where this debate is likely to go.
Right.
But
Right.
there's a problem of unfalsifiability on both sides because we can't rerun such a thing.
Right.
The closest we can do is like the twin experiments. Kids
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
same genetics raised in the same household, their experiences are going to diverge, of course, but
Right.
that's
Right.
as close as we can really get. And yet
Yeah.
we still see maybe it's not truly random in the sense we mean, actual unpredictability,
Mhm.
but there's something to be said for flashes of inspiration, like
Yeah. No, I
humans do
agree.
have the ability to act outside just their own experience, creativity.
Mhm.
I don't know. There's so many facets, and maybe it just is like ridiculously complicated. And maybe it's just my own wishful thinking. But it seems to me that if we did restart history on Earth and all the physical events went exactly the same way, so evolution turned out the same, the mass extinction events turned out the same, and so on, such that humans were here, I don't think history would necessarily play out the same way because there's going to be those moments where something is, as best we can determine, actually random. A
Yeah.
that spark of inspiration hits Laplace or doesn't,
Yeah. Yeah. I get what you mean. I guess to sort of play devil's advocate, the determinist would argue that that spark of inspiration is all predetermined. That it takes a certain mind, it takes a certain upbringing, it takes a certain even looking at the light play over water and it hits you in a certain way. All of that's predetermined. But I don't know how we could falsify or prove that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. We can't obviously replicate it, so I don't know how we would actually show that that is or is not the case.
Well, a flash of inspiration, if you will, occurs that if we could reproduce a flash of inspiration, a moment of spontaneous enlightenment or something like that, um,
Mm,
like you said, light on the water kind of thing.
yeah.
Um, anybody could have come up with general relativity or at least special relativity anytime
Mm,
after Maxwell published his equations. But it wasn't
sure.
until Einstein had a thought experiment about what would happen to a beam of light on a train moving at the speed of light that he
Mm,
started to actually cook it together into what became special relativity. So it took that special brain, that flash of inspiration. I'm not sure how we'd conduct the experiment, but I think there
oh,
is a way that we could try to cause those flashes of inspiration. And if we could cause them, then I'm not sure it would settle the question about free will or determinism, but it would kind of show that there are external forces interfering with our internal functions.
well, it's not really about external forces. That's the thing. Like I don't. Like I think nobody who is a determinist would say that it's only internal forces. External forces is completely fine. Um, Yeah, I don't know, but sort of free will, it sort of its crux rests upon that there is something that is not determined that causes it to occur. That there is something truly random about these flashes of inspiration, but I don't know how you would even approach showing that. It seems just such a weird question to try and ask. But anyway, I'm gonna play the video because we're gonna get off on a wild tangent
Yeah,
here.
we'll end up on
And
our
he'll
own discussion here.
well, he said like one sentence. We're 24
Mhm.
seconds in, and we've been going for 15 minutes. So this is about our rate. That's crazy.
Very
Okay.
strongly hold on to the notion of free will. I want to try to unpack one of the things that really sort of fuels that stance, which is we make decisions. We make choices. We sit there, we choose vanilla over chocolate ice cream. We choose to pull a trigger or not to do so. We are full of intent at that moment, and we make a choice. And there is something intuitively truly seductive about that. And unpacking the choice, the intent, We know we have the intent at that point. We have a pretty good sense what the consequence is going to be. We know we're not being coerced. There's alternatives available to us and to most people and to courts of law in the United States. That's enough. You have responsibility. And my starting point is that tells us nothing whatsoever about free will. It is completely irrelevant to it. Whether we form an intent to do this or to do that, that is completely irrelevant for a very simple reason. Because assessing behavior based on that is like reviewing a movie when all you've seen is the last 3 minutes of the movie. Because what you're never, ever asking with that stance is, oh yeah, where did that intent come from? How did you become the sort of person where that is the sort of intent you would form at that moment?
Yeah, so I think I'm right. I think he's sort of saying, hey, it is the entire lifetime of experiences and possibly genetic as well that form how you form your intentions, kind of thing. Um,
Yeah, like it sets the stage for what
right,
kind of person would pull the trigger in this situation? Well, your entire
right,
life tells that story. How did you become that kind of person?
right, right.
And it's interesting because it pushes, even in a free will context, it pushes back the decision to the factors that led you to the, it's almost like self-programming, right? Like I made the decision that now that I cared about being healthy and my life, to lose
Mm,
weight.
yeah,
So even if we remove the decision, we go back a step to where I made the intention. I programmed myself with the intention, and that's
right.
what enabled me to make the decision.
Mm. Yeah, no, well, I mean, so like you make a decision and you like you're saying, you have a good idea of the intention. So with your example, you'd be like, well, do I go to the gym or not go to the gym? That's the decision that you're looking at. So, you know, making the decision, you can push it back and say, hey, well, I had the intention, I had this, thing, I want to be healthy, kind of thing. I want to lose weight. But the thing is, there will be something behind that as well. There will be a you know a decision made that you want to try and do that before, and what led to that, and you can always sort of keep tracing these things back. But I don't think that gets at whether there is an actual um possibility of you going, screw it. You know what I mean? Like, there's sometimes and I guess it may be the illusion of free, but there's plenty of times where you really feel like you could either push yourself to go or just not care, or push yourself to go do this thing, or I have this video to edit or something, or you could just do something else.
Well,
And
it's kind of a priority thing, right? Like you run
sure,
through your current status, like how tired I am, how much energy do I have. This is an objective. It's
yeah,
something that I want to go do for whatever reason, either because it's healthy or because I enjoy
yeah,
it or what
yeah,
have you.
right,
But like you compare your different priorities. Is it most important, either physiologically or mentally or emotionally or whatever, that I need to rest? And maybe we don't break it down that fine, but we like weigh every possible option against our priority list. That said, there are definitely moments, at least in my life, where I've run down the list and the clear, obvious choice to make is, there's fireflies outside. I want to grab my camera and go out and get firefly landscapes. But I'm also really tired because I've been, up for 26 hours straight or whatever. So the
mm,
top priority is don't worry about it. Get some rest, catch the fireflies another night.
yeah.
But because I'm a crazy person, I override that sensible decision and go play with the fireflies anyway.
Right, right, exactly. So it's very difficult to sort of um push back against determinism when it can be said, well, we don't know what the factors are, but the facts played a role in it, kind of thing. It was all the factors that went into it. Because when you say, but because I'm a crazy person, that may be a determined by your neurology and your experiences in life, like what led up to you being. And this is the problem with I've found with hard determinists. that they can always say, hey, there's always priors to, well, anything really. I mean, if a rock rolls down a certain way, we can say, hey, there's priors for that. There's the rock, the way, the shape of the rock, the way it bounces, the physics on it. But a determinist can do that with anything. You can say, hey, it was, your experience as a 5-year-old kid with fireflies that led up to that decision of going and playing with the fireflies. But the thing that falls down for, well, not falls down, but the thing that gets me is that they say, well, we don't know what the priors are, but they're there, but we don't know what they are.
Yeah, and that's a problem scientifically speaking, because then, the skeptic just has to go, if you can't show me, then I don't believe you until you can.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's why I think the sort of either position is kind of unfalsifiable, because the compatibilist can't really point to something outside of these deterministic physical laws, something truly random. Like, we can't really give an example of something that is absolutely random. You can sort of point to the decay of radioactive matter, for instance. Not how much it decays, but which atoms decay. But having said that, it's kind of, just because we don't know which one will decay, does that mean it's in fact random? Just because it looks random, is it random? It's like saying, hey, the weather is random. Well, no, it's not. It's a determined thing. It's just, it looks random because, like Brownian motion, the movement of the particles we basically treat as random, but it's not. It's just too complex for us to understand all of the interactions, because as I had a really good talk with Grayson the other day, and as he pointed out, like, when you get more and more interactions, it's hard, more complicated to follow. And just because we can't follow it doesn't mean that it's random.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was a great talk. You also mentioned the 3-body problem in the same conversation, because there's clearly formulas, forces, things we could pin down, we just haven't yet. And it seems likely that there is probably, not for sure, but probably nothing in nature that actually is random. It's just we don't understand the processes well enough yet.
No, fair.
Because that's really the only thing to do. It's the only question to ask. Okay, let me give you a scenario that is laden with intent and choice. You got two people. They go in, they watch a movie. The movie is some inspirational movie about some guy who previously has been obscure and now does something incredibly heroic. And the first person comes out of the movie with an intent and a choice. They say, oh my God, that was so inspirational. Right now, I'm going to go over to that booth by the popcorn stand, and I'm going to sign over my life savings to Doctors Without Borders. That's how inspired I am. I intend to do that.
Good
and
charity.
The second person has an intent, makes a choice at that point, and they says, oh my God, that was the most outrageously manipulative movie. I can't believe that script. The cinematography was terrible. I'm outraged. I'm offended that they would charge I'm outraged at the theater, and I'm going to go right now and demand my money back. Okay, so we see two people who acted with intent to make choices. And the question obviously then is, how did they become the sorts of people where those are the choices that they would make, where those are the intents they would form? And if you come from a world of biology, as I do, that's a whole hierarchy of questions, because there's a whole hierarchy of things that went into each of those people intending to do what they do. Part of what was playing out in the previous minutes to hours. Were they angry? Were they hungry? Were they in pain? Were they sleep deprived? Were they stressed? Were they scared? Whatever, because we know people's choices will change dramatically in those circumstances. People's judgment, people's executive control, people's capacity to make one type of decision, if it is a tougher one, but it is more appealing in the long run. Okay, so that matters. What also matters in the previous hours to days are hormone levels, because that will have, if you had elevated levels of oxytocin, you're more likely to be trusting of what the movie was telling you. If you had elevated levels of testosterone, you were more likely to be pissed off and perceive the movie makers as having bad intent. But you also have to ask what was going on in the previous months to decades. As one example, if you had had a trauma and you now have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, a structure in your brain, the amygdala will have grown larger, and we can tell you down to the molecules exactly how that works. And when you have an amygdala like that, in circumstances that other people would decide are neutral, you're going to decide is provocative and threatening. And even though we understand much less about it, the same changes, the same drama would have occurred in your brain if in the previous months of the decades you had found love, you had found God, you had found all of that matters. Okay, so now we got to barrel back to adolescence and childhood. And I think no one needs to be convinced by now that the type of childhood you have influences the type of adult you become. What we've been learning since are the nuts and bolts, the epigenetics of how the brain you have as an adult sitting and watching that movie is going to be vastly influenced by how many traumas you had as a child, how much adversity, how much stimulation. And there's a whole world of developmental people who even have a scoring system. What is your ACE score, your adverse childhood experience score? Were you physically abused, psychologically, sexually? Were you witness to? Did you have a family member who was incarcerated? Was there somebody with a substance abuse problem? And each additional score you get in that questionnaire, there's about a 35% increased chance that by young adulthood, you will have a history of antisocial violence. Childhood matters. The culture you were raised in as a child matters.
Okay.
That
And
was a
this is where it
lot.
becomes difficult for me, because you have a 30% chance of becoming a violent offender kind of thing. I get that, but the fact that it's only 30%, that obviously two people can have comparable upbringings, and one chooses a life of crime and another one doesn't. That's where the problem comes up, that just because you do have a childhood trauma doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a similar outcome than somebody else that's had. And we don't compare traumas, but I guess, and I think somebody like Sapolsky would say, well, yes, but they haven't had an identical childhood kind of thing. And I get that. But you've sort of, I think from his standpoint, he's got to show that not only is there a propensity to have a similar outcome from a similar background, but it's kind of a necessity that happens. And I know that they don't have identical upbringings, but or identical genetics, but here's where it becomes difficult, because you can sort of say, hey, but John down there, he was abused by his father too, and he didn't grow up to be a serial killer kind of thing. But they would say, hey, they had different upbringings. I don't know. Do you get what I'm saying? It's very.
Yeah. It's like there's the potential for infinite excuses. Like a person goes through all the criteria that makes them high risk for a certain behavior type, and yet they choose different. And they go, well, he's the exception that proves the rule. Like we can. Statistics are weird, right? Like we can determine how much of a radioactive sample will decay in X amount of time, but not which specific atoms. We can determine how much of a population will do a certain thing based on a certain past behavior, but not which specific individuals, because statistics do not apply to individuals.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And so it borks everything when we try to increase the resolution. Zoom in and focus on what's really going on, the entire emergent property just vanishes. It effervesces.
No, I get that, but sort of with the atom decay in radioactive matter, is it we can't determine which atom will decay because it is truly random, or is it that we just don't understand the processes and be able to predict deterministically which one will decay? Like if we had this Gestalt supercomputer that had all the processing power in the universe, could we determine, in a sample of uranium, which atom would decay and which wouldn't?
Well, I don't think computing power is the problem. I think it's the uncertainty principle is a big part of it. Like, as you know, it's not that it's physically impossible to measure subatomic particles of certain kinds.
Yeah.
There isn't a law against it. We just don't have the ability to do it because the smallest things we can shoot at things to measure them with, photons, are big enough and massive enough, or, well, inertial force enough to knock them off course. And so it creates the uncertainty. It's not because that's a principle of the universe. It's because we lack the tools to get a better measurement without interfering. And I think
But
that's
just say we
one of the
had the
limits in
tools.
a radioactive decay situation.
Well, just say we had the tools to be able to measure it without sort of interrupting the you know what is happening in them. Just say we had some kind of technology to allow us to do that. Um, like so what I'm saying is this truly an acausal random process of which ones decay, or is it just it is deterministic and it's a limitation of our understanding all the factors going into it?
Yeah, I think with respect to that specific example with radioactive decay,
Yeah.
I have a hunch, let's say, that there is a physical process that we're not able to detect because it's so small. I
Right.
suspect it has to
Yeah.
do with exposure to antineutrinos, which are
Yeah.
necessary for nuclear division, but we can barely measure regular neutrinos in
Right,
vast
right, right.
quantities. So,
Yes.
yeah, it's who knows? It's a hypothesis and it'll be a
Right,
pain in the
right.
ass to verify. But I think there probably is some physical process that we just can't measure at this point.
Mm.
Are you raised in a culture of honor? Because as an adult, you were more likely to advocate aggressive responses to ambiguous social circumstances, and you're more likely to secrete stress hormones at the time. Were you raised in an individualistic or a collectivist culture? Because that's going to influence your levels of trust and cooperation with people you don't know. Were you raised in a culture with this value, with that, to turn the other cheek, to take revenge because if they take your camel now and you do nothing, tomorrow they'll take the rest of your camels? All of this is instantiated in the brain you develop. But you got to push back even further, back to your fetal life, because what was going on there was directing the brain and its construction that you were going to have now in that moment, forming that intent in that movie theater. If, for example, you were exposed to a lot of stress hormones as a fetus because mom was stressed as hell, trying to pay the rent, being homeless, whatever, you're going to develop a larger amygdala. And as a result, you are going to have an elevated stress response, which is going to make your judgment and executive control not as effective as usual. If you were, as a fetus, deprived of calories, as an adult, you're more likely to form the intent, screw Amnesty International and screw getting my money back. I'm going to go get a lot more popcorn because you will have developed with fewer dopamine neurons in your reward area and you will have less satiation. And you will be more prone towards adult onset diabetes, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, obesity, all of that because of your fetal life.
So here's the crux. It like when you say you're more prone, um, yes, but what is causing one person to do that and one person not to? Because when we say more prone, it is more likely. The possibility is higher. So then you're talking about, well, um, obviously it's not everybody that goes through this um, is going to go out and do these things, right? You could have somebody that you know their mother was in a situation where they didn't have a lot of food, but they don't do that. So what more prone means is, yeah, some people will, some people won't, and the likelihood is that you will, because that's a factor that contributes. But it feels like, well, um, it feels too easy for a determinist to say, well, if it wasn't that factor, it was some other factor. That's just an example of one of the cascading things that led up to it. Um, and I get that
Unintended
argument.
consequences.
Yeah, I get that
Unintended
argument.
consequences.
Well, I get that argument, but without knowing what it was and how to like, how can you tell that it was determined if we can't analyze the determining factors? I don't know how you can do that.
Yeah, you can't say what flipped the light switch if you can't even find the light switch.
Exactly. Exactly.
Then we got to push a step further back. Genes. Genes determine next to nothing. People have to be weaned off to that notion of sort of genetic molecular fundamentalism. But what genes do is influence how you are going to respond to environment. And by now, we know we differ from one person to the next. The variants of genes we have related to hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin. How able are you to have empathy? How trusting are you? How generous? Hormone genes related to your stress response. Do you see threat that other people don't? Genes related to your vulnerability to mood disorders, anxiety disorders, genes related to your propensity towards violence, depending on whether you were abused as a child or not. All of these come into it.
And
Robert,
one more minute.
You've got to push one step further back. Culture, where'd that come from? If your ancestors grew up in a world with a heavy infectious disease load, you're likely to be more hostile to immigration. If your ancestors grew up as shepherds, you are more likely to be aggressive than if they grew up as farmers. Where is behavior coming from? Where's responsibility coming from?
That's an interesting thing. If your culture originated from a shepherding culture, they're more likely to be aggressive than if you grew up in a farming, agricultural, just farming crops community.
Yeah, I'm curious if that's true, and while we can establish a statistical correlation, what's the
Yeah.
cause and effect behind that? That's very peculiar, I think.
Well, I think it'd be sort of so culturally, you're looking at, people that are herding. It's very easy to steal a sheep kind of thing, or steal um, um, herd animals from somebody because so back in primitive days, like, you'd steal somebody's sheep, you'd herd them round, and cattle rustlers, for instance. But it's very,
Yes.
very hard to rustle a field. Like, you can't just herd the field away and like get a whole bunch
Yeah,
of crops to go over here
that's
kind
more
of thing.
raiders. But
Well,
yeah,
yes, but
there's
yeah,
that. But then there's also the nature of harvesting the goods, I think, because a farmer, an agriculturalist, is only murdering corn, whereas the shepherd, at some point, he's going to have to slaughter the sheep, and there's not that much difference between slaughtering sheep and slaughtering humans.
well, that's true. I think it's more like generally agricultural communities, they sort of, because one person can't really um bring in a harvest, right? Like, you can't have one person just bring in a harvest, but you can have sort of, or one family. Generally agricultural communities had the entire, you know everybody would work together on the farms kind of thing, and help one
Mhm.
another,
Yeah,
whereas
that still
herders
happens.
generally. Absolutely, and herders were generally family oriented, where the family would have their herd kind of thing, and a lot of the history of herding is a lot of this. I mean, we have instances of vendettas in history where somebody stole somebody else's, bison or whatever, and there's a blood feud going for ages over who stole whose herd first, kind of thing, or part of somebody else's herd. So I think while agricultural promotes a very, very communal kind of lifestyle, that herding sort of it promotes a very, very tribalistic kind of lifestyle.
And
Or
actually,
more,
this is fascinating on another level because it to bring it back to one of our favorite topics, tangential but
right?
related, the
Okay,
Bible, the story of Cain and
sure.
Abel. It
Yeah.
it's generally agreed upon that started out as a tale told by an agricultural group of people that got invaded and overrun by the Proto-Semites who were pastoralists. So the
Yes.
story saying the son of the first humans who
Mm.
grew the plants was good
Yes.
and peaceful, and the
Yeah.
son who shepherded the sheeps and whatnot was very aggressive and will fucking kill you.
Yeah.
That kind of tracks, symbolically speaking.
Right. But it's interesting, it's a very interesting conversation. And it leads you to sort of think about, would you, like, how much does your country, and the culture that you're raised in, influence your attitude towards the world? Um, do Americans have a different attitude than Australians because of the way that your culture has impacted on you? Um, and I would have to say yes, it definitely has an influence. People see Australians as very chill, very, very relaxed people. Like, we don't get upset about much, but Americans not so much.
Oh
Um,
yes, we have many triggered people. Lots of snowflakes.
Isaac was Booba. Isaac was the son of Abraham. That was a lot later than Cain and Abel. A lot later.
Yeah.
A
Although
lot
that's
later.
a very fun story for different reasons.
For different reasons, yeah. So Cain and Abel were the sons of Adam, and yeah. So one offered um,
Delicious,
meat,
tasty ribs and lamb
yep,
chops and things.
and the other offered vegetables and crops from the field. Um, and I believe it was that Abel got jealous that Cain was going to inherit the kingdom or something, I think. Um, and so Cain killed Abel, but the silly thing is that instead of, like, punishing him, he gave him the mark of Cain because he was afraid that other people, I don't know where these other people were, because um, you know, um, oh no, Abel was the herder of sheep and Cain was the tiller of the soil.
Yes.
Interesting. So that's the opposite of what you said, because Cain was
No,
the
no,
farmer. Oh,
no. Cain was the shit. Well, shit. Now I'm all confuzzled here. Let me look it
yeah,
up.
yeah. I'm just reading it now. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cain was the farmer, and Abel was the herder. And because Abel gave the better tasty meats, he was favored by Adam, or favored by the Lord,
The
maybe.
aroma pleasing unto the Lord kind of thing.
Right. And here's the funny part. Here's the great part. Like, and the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel, your brother? Uh, why don't you know where he is and what happened?"
Right? Yeah, that's it. That one. It's right up there with the why he couldn't find Adam and Eve hiding in the
Yeah.
bushes. Like, how do you not know? Was it? Shoot, the story is so fucking fuzzy in my head. Was it the Holy Ghost who came down and told all of them, the soil screams out with his blood or something like that?
Yeah, yeah, that's this one. And he said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the soil, and so cursed you shall be by the soil that gaped with its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. If you till the soil, it will no longer give you strength. A restless wanderer shall you be on the earth." And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear. Now you have driven me this day from the soil. I must hide from your presence. I shall be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." And the Lord said to him, "Therefore, whoever kills Cain shall suffer sevenfold vengeance." And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, that whoever found him would not slay him.
Yep.
And then Cain bore Enoch.
Yep, he wandered off and
Mm-hmm.
he was supposed to be a wanderer all the days of his life. went off over the hills, immediately found a city full of other people, married one, and popped out a child.
Yep. He went from the Lord's presence and dwelled in a land of Nod, east of Eden. And he became the builder of a city, called the name of the city like his son's name, Enoch, which is just like, okay, so he's supposed to be a wanderer all his days, built a freaking city and stayed there.
Mm-hmm.
No contradiction, apparently. Well, that was a tangent, but interesting, yeah. Yeah, so Bible gets it wrong again.
It's coming from 1 second ago to thousands of years ago. And what we have here are a number of punchlines. The first one is, history matters. The past isn't even past. And what we see over and over is the biology of why luck does not even out over time, as Dan has often said. Instead, bad luck amplifies and good luck and privilege amplifies in the opposite direction. What we also see is a realm where these are not just biological influences. If you're talking about genes, you're talking about their evolution. You're talking about the epigenetics of your fetal life that regulate them. You're talking about the proteins they made 20 minutes ago. It forms one continuous arc of biology in which there is not a crack there into which you can shoehorn free will. If it was 500 years ago and somebody said, wow, we just noticed when people get hammered over the head, their behavior changes, the brain may be relevant, that's one thing.
Well, I mean, you know, what's hilarious is a lot of the sayings and aphorisms that we have stem from cardiocentrism, the idea that your heart is the source of all rationality and thinking. They they kind of, you know, especially ancient Greek days, they kind of go into, you know, reason with your heart kind of thing. Like, and it isn't sort of a metaphor like we're using. It literally is. They thought that the heart is the thing that did the thinking.
Know a ton now. We know enough to present the challenge. Show me a brain, a person who has just done something completely independent of every one of those biological environmental influences I just outlined, and you've
hold it. Show me someone that has done something independent of those biological, and this is the problem I have with hard determinism. Like, how are you supposed to show that? Right? Like, I get what he's saying. Like, show me somebody that isn't being influenced by the thing, but that's, how do you do that? You know, it's kind of that unfalsifiability thing. It's sort of, and don't get me wrong, I get what he's saying, and I don't, you know, it's not like I have a huge problem with it. It's just, it's like saying, well, show me somebody that isn't influenced by God. It's like, well,
I'd reverse it. You know, I'd say, show me someone who made a decision only influenced by those things and nothing else. Like, how do you demonstrate?
To show as well? Yeah. Totally. But that's impossible to do as well. You know, because yeah.
Proven there's free will. And at this point, we know enough of this biology that the onus is on the free will believers. Unless you can show evidence of people's actions, people's behavior, people's personalities, proclivities, desires, etc., being independent of their biological and environmental history, you've presented no evidence that free will exists. And the only default stance there is to doubt that it exists, to not accept its existence.
First of all, I would like to issue a little disclaimer about your poll. You asked whether you believe in determinism or free will. I believe in both determinism and free will. And because I think that
that's a good point. I mean, he is a compatibilist. So when I say, do you believe in determinism or free will? Both.
Yeah. Why not both? Very rarely is there a true false dichotomy.
Oh, Dan Dennett, I love
true
you.
False dichotomy.
No, there's definitely false dichotomies. Like, yeah, and it's not very rare. They're all over the place. It's just, you know, they have to be encompass every single thing. So, like, are you playing tennis or doing something else? That's a true dichotomy. Oh, you mean false dichotomy, don't you? Yeah, are you playing tennis or going to the store? Is a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
There's tons of them.
It's probably not even. I mean, absolutely both is a great answer. Like, why not
Yeah.
both? I say that all the time. I love it. But also, there
Yeah.
could be other things too, like a possibility we haven't even identified. Maybe there is a truly random element in our thoughts somewhere.
Maybe.
We're not choosing at all. It's quantum processes.
Yes. And people say, like, I mean, I sometimes, like Leo, for instance, he says there's definitely acausal processes, things that have no cause. And it's like infinity. It's hard for me to say, hey, things are acausal. There's things that absolutely look acausal, that we think are acausal, but how do we know if something is truly acausal? It could just be that we haven't found the cause yet.
Mm-hmm.
So, we used to think that lightning struck a core, like there was no reason, well, that, God directed it, and then we thought there was no real reason where it struck. But at a point, some people thought there's no real reason, like lightning just strikes randomly. But we know that's not true. We know that it is a deterministic process of ions connecting from the ground to the upper atmosphere where this static electricity is gathering. We know that it's not just random happening. If that was the case, then lightning rods wouldn't work. We know that sort of, that these forces are interacting. Oh, good night, Tyler. Have a good night, mate.
Robert shows so eloquently is that he's been taken in by the philosophers who have inflated the idea of free will way beyond what it has to be. And he says, if you can't point to a decision you make which is completely free of all earlier considerations and influences, then you can't show free will. But that's just a daft notion of free will. And there's a strange tension in Robert's 10 minutes there. What's he doing? Why is he talking to me? Does he think he can convince me or convince anybody? I think I can convince people, and I think he thinks he can convince people. And that's because we are both receptive to reasons. Now, I agree with everything he says about the hormonal and developmental and epistatic developments that impinge on who one is at the time. That's the raw material each of us starts with, and we don't start in the same place. As he says in his book, Life Isn't Fair. And that's true. There are tremendous differences in style, in talent, in accomplishment, in education, in upbringing, in nutrition. That's true. The whole point of free will is that this is a socially evolved system which minimizes those, which takes steps to make the world safer for everybody. I counted on Robert being here today. I'm sure he counted on my being here. We both are reliable people. You can trust us. That's one of the key elements of free will, to be self-controlled. Now, Robert says, go back years and years and years, go back before your birth.
Yeah. So he's basically saying, well, your epigenetics, how your genetics interact with the world could be a factor, and that is reliant on sort of what your parents did when you were in the womb, kind of thing, and their choices are dependent on what happened to them in the womb, and then their experiences leading up to having it. So this is what I mean. Like, you can always go back to priors. But what we really want to know is there any actual decisions in there?
Well, I wonder if we could argument to absurdity this, because this sounds a lot like an infinite regress waiting to happen, right? Like, what happened to your parents was determined by what happened to them in the womb, which was determined by what happened to them in the womb. Like, how far back does this go? Is there a way to cut loose and break that cycle? Or do we have to go all the way back to the abiogenesis moment and say that it was caused by, some amino acid that first self-replicating RNA was exposed to,
I want to go back even further. I want to go back to the beginning of life. Because when evolution gets...
Beginning, so we're going back all the way to abiogenesis now?
I mean, oh, I wasn't expecting that, but okay. That sounds fun. Let's explore it.
Okay, so okay. I mean, yeah, you can go like just say, for instance, we were a silicate-based life form instead of a carbon one. He's basically saying, hey, your decisions would be different today. I wouldn't exist today. Like I don't know. It's yeah.
Started. What begins is a process of skill development. The very first living things were better at staying alive and making progeny than the alternatives.
Yeah.
And it's been a
That's basically evolution in a nutshell, sure.
growth of skill and competence ever since. And there's skills that Robert and I have that many people don't have, and there's other skills that we don't have. I can't play the violin. I can't dance the minuet. I can't read Persian. There's lots of things I can't do. Too bad, but I've got my own set of skills. He's got his own set of skills. And what civilization has done is to, over the centuries, over the millennia, what civilization has done is to distill out the most important skills for making people safe and reliable citizens. And that is, they have the skill of self-control. Now, that's what evolution is all about. Evolution is about the evolution of the skill of self-control. And we are
Is it?
better self-control.
Well, I think a skill of evolution is self-control. Is some sort of governing over your own impulses and intuitions and your autonomous behavior. I think that is definitely something.
I see where he's going with this, though. That
Right.
there's the possibility that free will isn't what you choose to do. It's the ability to choose not to do something. Self-control.
Yeah. So take this for instance. You're a hunter, a caveman, basically got your spear, people around you. You have to overcome the fear response in order to, say, hunt the mammoth kind of thing. Like usually it will keep you alive by, running away, screaming in terror kind of thing, and that's what you want to do. That's what your evolved systems and mechanisms say, hey, that's what you should be doing, is running in a panic because that thing's huge and will, kill you in 2 seconds. However, you can kind of overcome that, but you only overcome that when you have everybody around you also. It's like solo, your best choice is to run screaming from the mammoth kind of thing. Like you shouldn't bother it because it's going to absolutely squish you. So I don't know. That's a very interesting position.
Why we like these guys. They're brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we have many more degrees of freedom than any other living thing on the planet. We have a lot more skill. If a tree falls and kills somebody, we don't hold it responsible. It doesn't have the skill. It doesn't have the perceptual organs. It's not able to prevent foreseeable damages because it can't foresee, but we can. Now, there's a quote that I love from the late great novelist and critic Tom Wolfe, who said, the conclusion people out beyond the laboratory walls are drawing is, the fix is in, we're all hardwired. That, and don't blame me, I'm wired wrong. Well, if you're wired wrong, I won't blame you, but what about being wired right? Not perfectly, but well enough to be held responsible and to hold yourself responsible. I assume Robert has a driver's license. He has self-control enough. I'm not scared if he's out on the highway because he's basically sane and he has self-control. There are other people who shouldn't be on the highway. Now, one of the points that he makes a great deal of in his book, and it's an important one, is that we have to draw the line somewhere. Some people just miss the boat for having the kind of skill, the kind of self-control that entitles them to treat themselves as responsible agents, to make contracts, to make promises, to take care of yourself, to go free in the world. Now, we're learning every day, and Robert has a lot to say about this, ways in which people have diminished self-control, diminished capacity. And we have to recognize that beyond some point, and it's going to have to be arbitrary, like driver's license age, we have to say, I'm sorry, you're not responsible. You have lost your free will.
Well, I don't know anyone that disagrees with that. Like that, at least to some degree, prior circumstance and prior experience is a mitigating factor. I was mentioning that earlier. Like, I don't know anybody that would go, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know anyone that would go, oh, well, you are schizophrenic and delusional and you see things, we're going to treat you the same as somebody that, that they kill somebody in a delusion. We're going to treat you the same as someone whose wife's cheated on him and he's going to go and take revenge, kind of thing. I think everybody would agree with that. That one thing is different than the other. But it becomes hard because you sort of can go, well, obviously that person who has had schizophrenia and a history of delusion, they've got a mitigating factor. But why, if everything's deterministic, why doesn't the guy that's going for revenge have a mitigating factor as well?
Yeah, revenge is most people would consider a very strong mitigating factor, even if it's on the choice side rather than the nature side.
Would they? I mean, we consider crimes of
it
passion.
Depends. Yeah,
well, we consider crimes of passion, but a crime of passion is different than revenge. So really, when they talk about the mitigating factor of a crime of passion, it's basically, you come in and your wife's cheating on you and you lose your shit and something happens, right? That's a crime of passion, as opposed to a premeditated thing, which is basically going away, constructing a plan to take revenge and carrying it out over a sequence of time, kind of thing.
I suppose. I see them both as acts of revenge, but the one definitely has a much more of a calculating component to it. A deliberate decision to break the law, even if it's the same emotion that's driving it.
Right. But if you take determinism into an account, why do we give more weight to the person that snaps at the time? Because it wouldn't be under your control. It would be a series of things like Sapolsky was saying, like in your past, that your mum grew up poor and couldn't afford food, and so your amygdala is bigger. All of these factors, kind of thing, that grew up and made you the person who would go away and formulate a plan and then go back and execute that plan to get revenge. Why is that a less mitigating factor and less under your control than somebody with a temper who barges in on that and commits a crime of passion?
I could come up with a reason, but I'd be making it up. It's one of those arbitrary lines that our society has just said, and maybe the people who said thought they had good reason, but I don't think they really understood how deep this all actually goes, because we as a society still don't understand how deep it all actually goes.
Right. I mean, our justice system treats people as if they have free will, I guess, is what I'm getting at. Like it reacts in a way that is consistent with a free will argument and absolutely maintains that everybody has a chance to do something different. And yeah, I don't know. I just I find hard determinism. It's hard to say, hey, this person is worse than that person, or this person is less this person had an option to do something else. Like if you're saying that, then what is the I don't know. It's interesting. Like maybe it would be correct to say if this person had a premeditated plan, then they're more predisposed to executing this sequence of events rather than this only happening if being caught in the moment. That they are predisposed to calculating how to get maximum impact on the person rather than sort of just doing something regrettable on the spot that if they had time to think about it, they wouldn't. So maybe one of those is more dangerous to society than the other for whatever reason.
I think that's true, but I think it's the impulsive person who's more dangerous.
That is true. That is true. Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Well, is it though? Because if you are a person to go away and go, well, I understand like society and the law, but I am going to execute this plan anyway. I'm not sure there which is more dangerous.
Well, I guess it depends on what we mean by dangerous. In this context, I mean as a threat to society, which is what the justice system is supposedly punishing.
Yeah.
I feel like a person who can go into a situation that would trigger a revenge response, and the first instinct is to not act rashly, but instead to withdraw and plot and scheme and whatnot. Yeah, they're making a deliberate choice to violate the law, but they're also taking greater pains to make sure, while they're going to do something very illegal, that A, they get it right, and B, they minimize collateral damage. Like the impulsive person, if all they have on them is a grenade, they might pull out the grenade and kill who knows how many people.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
The revenge person might spend a year learning how to use a sniper rifle to make sure he gets that guy specifically, you know?
But I'd argue that second person that's using the sniper rifle, that will turn into a serial killer, somebody that will solve their problems, and they have a way less chance of being caught than somebody who throws a grenade and presumably blows themselves up as well as everybody else. But we're, in a hypothetical. But I think that one of these people will do this thing and then instantly be caught, and one of them will turn into a guy that's a serial killer that's very difficult to catch.
Well,
because
not necessarily. I mean, there are a lot of psychopaths running around who are no threat to society at all, because even though they have no moral or ethical compunctions about taking human life, they won't even hesitate if they feel it's necessary.
Yeah, but we're talking about someone who has taken human life, like a psychopath that has taken, let's not
it's not like a man-eating bear. Once you get a taste for human meat, you keep coming back. That's not how that works. It's because they don't care. Like once you have, look at a neurotypical person, right? A GI who comes back from war, they've had to take lives. They go through the PTSD, what have you. They get help, hopefully, they process it. They don't necessarily have this urge to go out and take more lives now that they've done it, There's so many people, both psychopaths and not, who have killed and feel no desire to ever kill again.
Yeah, but it's not just psychopaths. I mean, there's a lot of killers that have, borderline personality disorder or schizophrenia, for instance. That they have a lot of these other things going on, or it could just be a gangbanger kind of thing. Who knows? That's the culture that they've grown up in.
I suppose that's fair, because once you've killed, it is much easier to kill after that.
Sure.
It has nothing to do with determinism. It has everything to do with control. I'm getting old. I may lose my marbles one of these days, and then I'll lose my self-control. I'll lose my free will. Free will is an achievement. It's a skill. It's not a metaphysical feature. So when you understand that free will is something that has been described in some detail and with lots of improvements over the centuries by civilizations, and we've made tremendous progress. one of the things I really admire about Robert's book is he goes back and gives lots of detail about the horrific punishments that used to pass muster, that used to be considered honor. None of us want to live in that world. That's terrible. Look, we've made improvement. We've gotten better. We've evolved. We've arrived at a point where we don't draw and quarter people. We don't, and we don't need the.
Well, not physically. We kind of emotionally draw and quarter them. Never mind. I'm just making a joke.
Horrific blame of guilt in the eyes of God. That's a barbarism that we can exclude.
And one more minute.
Yeah, one more minute. Yes. Now, I find myself in an odd position of saying to a biologist that he should take evolution more seriously. That evolution, as the title of my book, Freedom Evolves, makes clear, shows that there was no free will at all billions of years ago. And the free will has been growing and growing and growing as we become ever more capable of controlling ourselves and controlling each other.
That is
and thinking about how to control ourselves and improving.
What's that?
We're looking at this from a very human-centered perspective, right? Like, we know many other primates are capable of decision, are capable of self-restraint, so on and so forth. We know dogs can exercise self-restraint. We've all seen dogs trained so that they don't take the treat on the nose, so forth. So depending on what it is you define free will as, at what point does it manifest? Like a bacteria, one might say, clearly does not have free will, even though it appears to be capable of performing some of these feats.
Response. Yeah.
Humans, we would say, clearly do. So at what point of complexity does a free will switch flip on? At what point are organisms just moist robots carrying out programming?
It's a good question. So I think I would lean towards at the point where your cognitive ability can overcome autonomous functions, for instance, like we can stop breathing for a while, like we can hold our breath, kind of thing, and we can decide to do it. We can actually, sort of decide, hey, I'm going to hold my breath until you pass out, and or you have so little oxygen that your autonomous feet, things start to go over. But is that a sign of free will that I can hold my breath? I don't have to do that. At least for a while.
I don't know. I personally have always considered consciousness to be the ability to override biological programming, instincts. I mean, there are people who can actually control their heartbeat the same way most of us can control our breathing, but I don't know of anyone who can control their digestion or the shedding of their uterine lining or anything like that. It's not under direct conscious control.
No one reliable. I mean, there's always gurus out there who can claim to live on sunlight and control their cell growth and stuff, but no one that's reputable that would say that. Absolutely.
I think it comes to biological utility, like the ability to control when you excrete waste. That's an automatic function, and it will happen if you hold it in too long. But it's a definite evolutionary advantage to be able to hold it and then release it at a good time rather than in the middle of a hunt, for example, or when you're being pursued by a predator or whatever. So that's just one example, but I'm sure if we thought about it, we could come up with dozens of ways that being able to override instinct and have direct control of automatic functions gives a survival advantage. So evolution would select for those. And when they start coming together, the most efficient way to handle those might be a neurological system that considers itself to be a single unified organism and interprets through sensory information that all of these things are a decision-making process. And in a way they are, because it's possible to make mistakes.
Right.
That's a whole other angle. Mistakes
Yeah.
are possible, therefore we cannot be robots executing programs.
Yeah, but mistakes are possible even if we don't give the leeway of consciousness. You know, like if a bacteria zigs when it should have zagged and gets eaten, kind of thing, like that's a mistake. But did the bacteria have any control over that, or was that just an autonomous response of being jostled in the wrong way? And you know, it's just a fault in its sort of programming, if you will. I hate use that word, but is it a fault in the way that it's evolved to respond to stimuli? It's a question of, are mistakes actually something that you've decided erroneously, or are mistakes a bug in the system? Is
A
the question. Like,
manifestation of natural selection.
maybe, right? So if you don't hold it and you're in a hunt as a caveman, and you know, crap your loincloth in an inopportune moment, is that a bug in the system? You know, probably.
Yeah, it's very peculiar. I don't know. The whole thing, it's fascinating from a philosophical perspective, but from a science perspective, it just, well, it makes me go back to philosophy, because it makes me feel like it's all argument from incredulity. It's free will of the gaps, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and Robin's in the chat. Thank you so much for giving us this debate, Robin. I do want to point that out. Now, I will throw you a link in the description, but I do want to link Robin as well. Pragmatic Crystal was around. Usually they do the links because
Yeah,
they're
PC
just
got it earlier
amazing.
in the stream, but
Yeah,
I
PC did
think
get it earlier.
PC's a busy lady. She's
Yeah, I
circulating
know, I
around
know.
half the internet.
I really appreciate it though, and we really appreciate Robin as well, who does
Yeah,
so
your
much.
suggestion was a lot better than mine.
Yeah, no, you suggested the modern day debate one that they had recently. It would have been, you know, it's not a bad idea. It would have been really interesting to break down the way that the it was a Noah's Ark debate, and one of my good friends, Max, from I believe he's from Argentina. He was debating, filling in for Ozian over there, and it was a really good first debate. He made notes. He was doing really well. A few criticisms I would have, but the other guy, like the Gish Gallop and the off topicness of him, was incredible. Just incredible. So, well, if we get through this one, you can choose the debate. You can always choose that one. So there would have been a lot to discuss over sort of, you know, the nuts and bolts of it. I feel sorry for Ryan, who was trying to keep them on topic. It was kind of, you know, poor guy. I really do feel sorry for him. So yeah. But yeah, yeah. He's from Paraguay, is he? Oh, that's terrible.
That's Paraguayist.
No, he's from Uruguay. You are gay. That's a Simpsons reference.
Their methods of self-control, and there's a long way to go. And
he reads them like Homer Simpson reads a map and says, "You are gay," and it's just like, wow, okay, well.
I mean,
yeah.
you know, sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. I think we're all a little gay. I can be very happy.
He himself has spoken about the desire to educate people and get them to see. Well, he wants to say that they don't have free will. I say they don't have the kind of free will that some philosophers say they should have. But that's not a variety of free will that anyone should care about. It's not worth having. I have never seen anybody explain why it would be desirable to have an undetermined will. We want our will to be determined by the facts and by our values. That's what self-control is. One thing that Robert says that I would actually invite him to back off on. He says at one point, it's logically indefensible, ludicrous, meaningless to think that something good can happen to a machine.
So I've been tossing up with this idea. Because the idea of morality applying under a deterministic world, I thought, well, you can't have morality under a deterministic sort of, if hard determinism is true and we're just the results of our programming or our priors, how do you then apply morality to it, what you ought to do and what you ought not to do? But I think it's actually easier to apply it because so we know computers are deterministic, right? We know that they're just a product of what we put into them and the architecture that's being used, and we know it's deterministic. But you can sort of apply ought to a computer as well when it does what it ought to do, and when it something that it ought not to do, right? Like when a computer blue screens of death, if you've ever got that one under Windows, it's not doing what it ought to do, right? Like there is something that it should be doing. And yes, a lot of that is from design, because we designed it to do certain things, but a lot of it is the functionality of that computer, which you can have under natural selection and evolution. So we could say when humans are doing what they ought to do, they are acting in correspondence with what enables humans to evolve successfully.
I suppose I kind of look at it a different way. Like it's a self-created additional layer of programming. Like you've got your natural instincts and all this and that. We get together, we've decided that collective well-being is a priority, and so we create this ethical system and overlay it on top of the biological instinct and say, this stuff, we're going to call it morality. We want everybody to incorporate it into their decision-making algorithms within their deterministic brains. I think you could still have it, but on the other hand, if it is deterministic, even with inserting morality or something, it still wouldn't mean anybody's making a choice. It's just another input into the algorithm,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a machine. I'm an evolved machine made of machines, made of machines, made of machines. There's nothing magic about me, but good things can happen to me and bad things can happen to me. That's how good a machine I am. It seems to me that Robert has a secret yearning for a sort of magical power, which he realizes he can't have.
Okay.
I say, no, you can have it.
Unfortunately, I'm in Manhattan right now, so there's at least 4 fire engines within a quarter-mile radius, but that's just the norm here. Well, amazingly enough, I don't agree with everything you said, Dan, amid my greatly admiring sort of the eloquence with which you've argued for free will. I think there's something very interesting that you brought up, that quote of mine at the end, which was saying it's ridiculous to say that anything good can happen to a machine. You didn't finish the quote, where I then say, nonetheless, at my very core, I think it is a good thing when we are made to have lives with less pain and more happiness.
So you
So
agree with me?
yes, okay. So a good addendum.
Can a good thing or a bad thing happen to a machine? Can a good thing or a bad thing happen to a machine?
That sounds like equivocation to me. Like somebody's trying to apply. What do you mean by good? Do you mean good as in it recognizes it a positive? Like if somebody bought me an ice cream, I might call that a good thing.
Yes.
But it's also unhealthy, so it's also a bad thing from a certain point of view. If I give my car, somebody mentioned an oil change, right? If I give my car an oil change, that's a good thing to do for a car. So a good thing happened to it, but it perceive it as a good thing? It doesn't have that capacity. So no,
Well, that's true. That's true. But if you're looking at it from purely the functionality of that thing, you could then mention it in terms of good and bad. Like, for instance, you could say that an ice cream is bad for you, kind of thing. Wow. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So what makes us, so under determinism, what makes us, what makes good and bad? How do we, so really we're into the weeds of meta ethics here. So
Mm.
how do we apply under determinism, and you're just a physical receptors, how do we apply good and bad?
Well, first you got to
Because
eat of this fruit that the serpent handed to me.
I'm not
And
sure
then,
that a lot of Christians are hard determinists, to be honest with
well,
you,
that's
Ember.
the thing, though, is in order to answer that question, you have to presume some type of knowledge about what good and evil are, what their nature is.
Right, right. Yeah, okay, okay.
There. Okay, so where we don't agree. One of the
Well, I mean, if you're choosing what good and bad is, like if I want to say, hey, human well-being is important to me, therefore that's what I sort of call good and bad. If I'm just a machine and there's no free will, and that's just something that's occurred to me because of all the priors in my life, then I'm not deciding that at all.
Yeah, so
That
your choice isn't a choice, and what you're
right.
labeling as good or bad or good or evil or whatever, that's not a choice either.
Yeah, but then that's kicking the can down the road. It's sort of
Mm-hmm.
saying, well, is that a good thing that I have determined and predetermined, or priors have determined that good is human well-being?
Yeah, I think that's an arbitrary declaration on our part. Maybe evolution leans in that direction. It's
Is it
encouraged us to come to that.
arbitrary?
Well,
That's the
yeah,
whole
because we just
question.
decided it. Like, we could have decided something else. We could have said
Could
what we're going
we?
to call good is what serves the interest of God, for instance.
But
Humans lived that way for centuries.
the whole point is, if everything is determined by priors, you could never have decided anything else. That we didn't just say, hey, human well-being is good. It was the way I was raised, the influence of my epigenetics, the growing up in the womb, as Sapolsky put it. Like that all contributed to me saying human well-being is a good thing. That there was no other outcome that would have eventuated.
Sure, but do remember this is a culture that's been coming up with better answers to these questions for the last several hundred
Sure,
years. If you were born in the
sure.
1400s, you might have grown up in a world where every source told you the greatest good is to serve God. And you said, maybe
Right.
you'd be an early atheist and you'd say, wait a minute, that's not really necessary. I can
Hmm.
think of a better answer.
Yes.
But yeah, it's context dependent. I think at least as he's proposing it, it kicks the can to the next generation back and the next generation back and the next generation back, and eventually you wind up with a first cause argument.
Well, I mean, ordinarily, I would sort of advocate for, well, pro-social behaviors among humans, at least. Human pro-social behaviors are incredibly important evolutionarily, that
Hmm.
we have survived on pro-social behaviors, and they are intrinsically tied to our success, kind of thing. But I think evolution doesn't have a preponderance for any kind of behavior. It's just that, um, if a behavior is more successful, if I decide pro-social behaviors suck, right? I'm going to go out by myself, screw everybody else, and I'm successful and is more successful than the humans cooperating, then evolution will say, well, you're the favored species, or the favored race, if you will, as Darwin put it. Like, not that I'm a different race than anybody else, but favored sort of behavioral. Do you get what I mean? Like, I'm doing the favored behavior if I'm just more successful.
Right. Yeah, I do get it. It kind of it makes me think of the agricultural revolution, right? Like
Right, right.
the first group of people who got together and did that communal farming thing to such a degree that it was possible for some people to start to specialize. Like now one person can like start to study anatomy and become like a rudimentary physician. So that settlement suddenly has a huge survival advantage compared to all the other nomadic tribes around the area.
Yes.
And so, yeah, the pro-social stuff, it builds up exponential advantages really fast.
Mm.
The thing we agree on. Both of us agree, lest we get caught in the sort of mud with this, we both think punishment and reward are okay to use in an instrumental sense.
Yes.
So completely in agreement on that. Okay, so where we're not in agreement. So the first issue is an interesting one in terms of what you describe sort of the evolution of. You point out, say, we do not flay people and burn them at the stake anymore. We have evolved. And in some way, I think you're equating that we have evolved to have more free will, because you're yoking our capacity for self-control to evolution an awful lot. The fact that we don't burn people at the stake anymore, I think shows exactly the opposite, which is over and over throughout history, we have learned, someone is actually not responsible for this. Somebody does not control the weather and thus deserves to be burned at the stake as a witch. Somebody has an epileptic seizure, not because they're sleeping with Satan. Somebody has trouble learning to read because they have dyslexia and we know the neuroanatomy of it, rather than they're lazy and unmotivated. At each one of these steps where we have subtracted out responsibility, where we have viewed the world as having less free will, it's become a much nicer place to live in.
But is nicer better? That's the thing. When you're looking at evolution, I mean, evolution doesn't seem to care a lot about what's nice.
Yeah,
like that is an entirely anthropomorphic idea that, hey, this is nice. Yeah, I don't know about that one, because he's sort of saying, hey, it's become a much nicer society. I agree, but that seems to be very subjective. And if you're talking about evolution as far as all animals are concerned, that's incredibly subjective. So I'm not sure about that one.
Now, as a second point, sort of you're alluding then to what I think is another
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to eat whatever you want, like your thing with the ice cream earlier. It's nice to have ice cream all the time, but is that actually good? Like to have every meal as ice cream, like
it's good if it makes you happy, but it's not good for health reasons. So,
right?
What is
Yeah.
good?
Well, I think it comes back to morality and oughts is very relative to what you want the outcome to be, or what the outcome that you're looking for is. That it's like good and bad seem to be a lot of the time contextual. Good for who? Or and good for what? Yeah, yeah.
incredibly like tempting, seductive way in which to get into trouble, which is to make this false dichotomy. Yes, most people will admit we have no control over some of the attributes that we were given, that we were gifted with, that we were cursed with, and so on. Some of us are tall, some of us have perfect pitch, some of us have good memory spans for digits, some of us this or that, and we were given these traits. Yeah. Most people will now believe, rather than being Calvinists, that this was outside our realm of control. What people then do is this like leapfrog over this Grand Canyon of a false dichotomy into, but where we have free will is what we do with those attributes. Do we show tenacity? Do we show gumption and backbone when the
Okay, so I think he's going to argue that the tenacity and backbone and us doing these things is just like the intellect, or like the ability to memorize things, out of our control as well. And I'm not sure I'm on board with that. I think to a certain degree it is, like, whether you're stubborn or whether you're you don't have the ability to follow through on things. Like, I mean, I have ADHD, right? is my attention span something that I have direct control over? A neurologist would definitely say no. Can I overcome that through what I feel is a sheer force of will? Yes, I would say so. He's sort of arguing that no, that's not what's happening here.
Yeah, that's
I
another good point. Is the ability to change. Like when the first example you brought up, a stubborn
right,
person. I've known people
right,
who are very stubborn and reactionary, and
yeah,
once it was brought to their attention that they were making their own lives harder than it needed to be, and there was the ability for them to change their nature, you might say, um, with patience and dedication and time, they were able to become better people. And is that
that
free
wasn't
will though?
it wasn't instantiated by themselves, right? That it was the drawing this to the attention and maybe somebody pointing out all of the negatives it has in their life and the lives of the people around them may be the prior that the determinist would point to and say, hey, that, it wasn't a choice, a free will choice, because there's all these other factors. But against that, I would say, well, just because there's like I don't see any decision not having any prior input. Like I don't see any decision being made free of prior inputs. Like, what do I feel like doing today? Or how much money do I have in the bank? Every decision will have a multitude of prior inputs. So, yeah, in that case, what is free will? If you're just influenced by all these priors, but yeah, I don't know. It's very difficult. I think I've convinced myself of free will and not about 5 times already during this conversation.
I honestly I don't think we're going to get to a for sure answer. With a lot of
Yeah,
debates we can, like the Noah's Ark debate, there's
yeah, we're
definitely
pretty.
a correct
Yeah,
conclusion. But something like this, there's so many unknowns, and then there's also the strong possibility that the way the debate itself is framed is
mm,
missing the bigger picture. So
yeah,
I think
maybe.
we're not going to get resolution, but what we are going to get is a whole bunch of really interesting ideas that can
Yeah.
can stretch out our meat computers a bit.
Hmm.
Going gets tough. Do the tough get going? Do we show self-control? Or conversely, are we privileged and gifted and we squander it away with self-indulgence? The seduction is that things like, oh, how good your memory span is, what type of receptor you have for this neurotransmitter relevant to memory. Yeah, that stuff you were given. But what you do with it, more gumption, your control or lack thereof, that's made of fairy dust. That's magical stuff. That's a completely different category. And what we see is self-control is as biological of a trait as is your eye color, as is your capacity to play the piano, as is your height. It's a different kind of biology. For my money, it's a hell of a lot more interesting biology, but it's just as biological. And what it's embedded in is a squishy, real, biologically yucky part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. You develop a good prefrontal cortex, you are going to be good at showing self-control as an adult. You will be better at doing the hard thing when it's the right thing to do. Are we responsible for the sort of prefrontal cortices we have? Not a chance. Here's one example that should stop people right in their tracks, that should have people out, yelling at the barricades and singing like revolutionary songs from Les Mis. By the time a child is 5 years old, the socioeconomic status of their parents is already a predictor of the thickness of their prefrontal cortex and its metabolic rate. And big surprise, it goes in the direction of if you very imprudently intended and chose to be born into a family in poverty, you're going to have a screwed up prefrontal cortex on the average by the time you're 5 years old.
Well, he skipped over on the average very fast there.
He's doing a little bit of skipping, and it's bugging me a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah,
Like
same.
on that note, that it's a statistical relationship again. It's a correlation, not a
Mm,
causation necessarily.
mm.
Like we've all met really, really rich, really, really dumb people with poor
Oh, yeah.
self-control. A
Oh,
former
yeah.
president of the United States comes to mind.
I was thinking that too.
You know?
Yeah.
In fact, more than one of them, although some are worse than others.
Mhm.
It's yeah, it's and likewise, just because a person is born poor doesn't mean they're biologically predisposed to poor. I mean, I was born poor. Yeah, I'm still poor, you know? And
Yeah.
and my oldest child just graduated with a master's degree in biochem science. It's so sciencey, I don't even have the fucking language to describe what their degree is even in. Like, that doesn't
Yeah,
necessarily have anything to do with the prefrontal cortex or self-control. But the point is that, and yes, I know statistics don't apply to individuals. I said that myself earlier. But I don't think the correlation itself is even valid, because we've got a population percentage issue, right? Like 50% of Americans are poor, like below the poverty line, as Congress
Yeah.
defines it. And only, 1% of Americans count as rich in the way people mean rich. And it's just, what does any of these things mean? There's so many terms that are just like so vague and blurry and just thrown out. And it's kind of infuriating. And that's just the most recent point he made. I mean, don't get me wrong. I dig this dude. His neurology is fantastic, but there's so much that just is so glossed over. Like the dismissing the human capability for self-directed self-improvement. Like, you're born, there have been so many people who were born poor and illiterate. And even though there wasn't an immediate economic advantage to it, they went out of their way to teach themselves how to read. And then they started reading books about, economics or brain science or whatever. And we know, as a neurologist, he knows that the different ideas that you put into your brain create new neural connections. You get new pathways with every new idea you cram in there, especially when you're young, but it continues through your entire life. And so which topics you choose to study are going to change which connections you get. That's not determined by genetics. That's determined by the topics, the information, the way you're learning it, the way you're exposed to it. Is it from a book? Is it from a teacher who can answer questions? There's so many fucking variables. The brain you get as an adult is only partially influenced by your genetics and even your time in the womb. That's just your starting template. What happens after that is entirely experiential and partially self-directed.
Mm-hmm.
Ugh.
Bad luck evens out over time. Gumption is not made of biology. This is the biology, which every step along afterward is the biology and interactions with environment of why at virtually every juncture, this person is going to make the wrong decision and go in the wrong direction. And it has as little to do with choice and free will as your eye color does. I think the final point I want to make with that is running through that is a notion, again, of the gumption angle is a source of pulling out judgment and responsibility, which I think is simply antithetical to where the science is. If we can have a quote of yours, Dan, quote, "A good runner who starts at the back of the pack, if he is really good enough to deserve winning, will probably have plenty of opportunity to overcome the initial disadvantage. In other words, if he fails to show sufficient gumption to make up for that deficit, he doesn't deserve to win. It is a moral judgment that he was not able to overcome his initial bad luck, because control is made out of magic. Control is something that is not made out of biology." And I obviously strongly disagree with that. I think the very last point, Dan, is there's another realm in which I think you've been seduced into a great embrace of free will, which is you've got a lot more faith in intuition than I think is justified. For example, you have the really interesting two-stage model of decision-making, which, let's not get into it, but I disagree with, blah, blah, big surprise. But you...
Those type 1 and type 2 thinking? I mean, type 1 is intuition.
Maybe. I think a two-stage model, it isn't necessarily the same thing. My ears perked up at that also, because I was wondering if I wish he would go into it so that the audience knows what the fuck they're talking about. You know?
Yeah. No, I agree. two-tier model of creative thinking. Okay. Let me look
One
for
of
it.
its
Let me look for it.
strengths is it aligns with our intuitions. Quote, that model, quote, provides some account of our important intuition that we are the authors of our moral decisions. In other words, your model for why there's some free will is more acceptable because it fits with our intuition that we have.
Yeah, so system 1 and system 2.
What I found is a two-stage decision-making process. It suggests that before a decision is made, your brain first goes through and deletes. It narrows down from all possible options to a few realistic options, and then what you actually choose from is that shorter list of the realistic options.
Okay.
At least that's a quick Google, and it goes back to a paper from 1994. There you can find 3-step processes. You can find 1-step process. It's all models. It's not a solid real thing. It's just a descriptive overview for certain utilities.
Free will. And I think my last point here that I want to make is intuition is a really lousy guide for thinking about how the world works. Let me give you an example. I will bet, Dan, if you and I were sitting in a cafe 400 years ago, we were the same people and just as reflective, and we would have given money to NPR if it existed at the time, and all of that. We would have been the same reasonable people. It would have been probably intuitively obvious to us that certain people are meant to be slaves. In fact, they're so incapable of taking care of themselves, it's a blessing to enslave them and feed them and clothe them. And that's not intuitively obvious to us anymore. It's not intuitively obvious that it's okay to have 4-year-olds work in factories. But in the past,
well, it depends who you're talking to be honest with you, mate. Like rise of the resurgence of fascism. I think some people would say, hey, it's intuitive to do that, but that's aside the point. It's incredibly disgusting. I would agree with him, but I think it's because, like, I don't know, our intuitions aren't just a general feeling of things. They're also influenced by culture and what we've learnt to be right and wrong as well. I don't think it's as simple as sort of people talk about their intuition as just their gut feeling. I think there's a lot more that goes into that gut feeling than just what we're born with kind of thing. I think culture plays a huge role in that.
Right. Like Beamsy was saying earlier, a lot of the functions in basic training are to reprogram your instincts. So it's not just what you're born with.
Right.
would have seemed intuitively obvious to us as well. It's no longer intuitively obvious that a kid who has a cortical malformation and as a result reverses looped letters and has trouble learning to read because of their dyslexia, it's no longer intuitively obvious to us that they're lazy and unmotivated. But 40, 50 years ago, I suspect both of us would have found it obvious that this is a kid who just really isn't paying attention, isn't motivated. Over and over and over, our intuitions have proven wrong. Over and over, when we realize our intuitions are a very poor litmus test and we recognize we are intuitively punishing and rewarding and judging and all of that for things people had no control over and over, when we recognize that these intuitions, in fact, are based on responsibility, which is simply not there, the world becomes a better place. It really is a very good thing that we figured out witches don't control the weather, and we figured out that rotten, psychoanalytically poisonous mothers don't cause schizophrenia, and that people with a certain variant of a gene for the leptin receptor have trouble having their brains satiate rather than them just hating themselves and thus eating themselves into obesity. At every one of these steps, our initial intuitions have proven very, very suspect and wrong. And at each step, when we actually learn what's going on, we subtract responsibility out of it. And not only doesn't the societal roof fall in, it becomes a much better place to live in.
Indeed.
Yeah. No, he's got a good point there. And sort of the whole idea, we find people culpable way less than we used to. It used to be the whole idea was that you absolutely was in charge. Like if you did something wrong, then it was your choice with nothing else influencing you. You made that choice, kind of thing. I think we've sort of leaned away from that a fair bit. I do agree with him in that. I think there are some people who have absolutely no control over their behaviors. They literally are hallucinating, or they're delusional. They don't really have control over what they're doing. It's why we're not nasty towards Wesley Curry III, if you're aware of him.
Yes, for anybody who doesn't know, he's a fellow. He's one of the people who has trouble not preaching in chats. He's a fantastic musician, and he does have some interesting ideas and experiences that he can talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But when he gets on religion, it just derails everything.
It turns into in my opinion, a delusional rant. It is delusion at that point.
Yeah.
But I don't blame him. He's got problems that he's trying to deal with. It's just he's very disruptive, but I don't blame him for it. And no, I hear Robin. I really do. I think that he needs help. So that's why I don't blame him for it. And I'm always sort of, I wish him the best. I really do.
First of all, thank you, Robert, for giving me some wonderful examples to talk about. You quote me twice, and in both cases, you ignore the fact that I reject the view that you quote. So I forgive you for that, because you're not responsible. You couldn't help it. It was the various imbalances in your brain that led you to misunderstand the quote about the marathon. The very passage where you cite in your book, page B76 of Freedom Evolves, I go on to say, but that's wrong. I say that misleads. It underplays the role of non-fortuitous breaks in the race to responsible agenthood. If you'd read the rest of the sentence, but I guess you didn't have enough self-control to do that. But if you had, you would have realized that you were misquoting me. And as for the two-stage model, the whole point of that.
Wow, Dennett's ripping him up. Wow. Okay. Shots fired.
Yeah.
Article is
it's getting spicy down here.
To say the two-stage model doesn't work. So you sort of admitted that I didn't endorse that model. So you found one thing that I gainsayed about it. I said, well, it does meet an intuition, but I didn't on that ground support the model. In fact, I rejected the model. So, but since you don't have responsibility, I don't blame you. I'm a little sorry. I'm a little disappointed that you don't take responsibility for these errors. I try to take responsibility for my errors, and I would hope other people would too. At one point you say, as we've seen, rejection.
Yeah, so that I guess that's my problem. How do you blame that guy for not reading it if he didn't choose to do it? Yeah, no, Dennett's absolutely roasting him right now. But I get what he's saying, but just sort of saying, so the problem with that is saying, hey, we can't blame anybody for anything if everything is due to prior events that you didn't have control over. How do we hold anybody accountable for anything? That's an appeal to consequence, right? It's an appeal to, oh, well, I don't like it if this is the case. I'm very aware that argument is an appeal to consequence. Well, if things that were based upon what happened in the womb and how your prefrontal cortex developed, then how do we hold anybody accountable for anything?
Yeah, if everything is only an illusion of choice, then nobody's actually there's no point we can point at and say this is where you did something wrong, because it's not you doing it. In fact, the very concept of you. And I think this is why people have an issue with this argument in the first place, even though both sides are completely unfalsifiable, is because of that strong implication, the consequence that if the one side is true, There is no you. You're an optical illusion of your own mind.
I will push back on that. I don't think that's true. I think that the you may be an amalgamation of all those experiences and everything put together. Just because it's not some special thing, just because it is not some kind of separate thing than the entire amalgamation of your life, doesn't mean that it's not you. The question is the you that you have developed, the you that has come out, in any way being formed by anything other than your experiences? So did you choose the you to come out?
To an extent, I think so, because it goes back to those probabilities again. Like, an abused child is likely to grow up to become an abuser, but not always. Like, in my case, for example, I've mentioned before that, my parents were not great, and that's probably because of a recapitulation of what happened to them as children and what happened to their parents as children and so on and so forth. But I made the choice to do the opposite of what my parents would do. And of course, I still made mistakes as a parent. Every human makes mistakes, but I went out of my way to try to not do what the first instinct of what I learned as a child was to do. So there is an element of choice, and it goes back to that overriding thing, that capacity to take our programming and say, no, I'm going to do this instead,
Yeah, but is it that your brain developed in such a way to cause you to do that? Is
Well,
it that
it had to, right? My
sure,
brain had to develop in such a way that it was possible for me to learn to read. There's biological
sure,
limits on all of our capabilities and potentials. But
yeah,
within
and
those limits, there's still a could have gone this way, could have gone that way. And every biological deterministic factor says you should have gone this way, but somehow you went that way.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think the determinants would say, well, there was probably some, I mean, the thing is, you can always sort of say, hey, but other things may have led you down this other track. Um that's the problem. And because I can argue with myself to a large degree, I think that even if you can't hold people accountable, you can take actions as if they were accountable in order to protect the society from the predetermined actions that have been made. So,
I think in the case of like crime and punishment, I don't think it
yes,
matters, because even if a person's actions to commit a crime are
yes,
deterministic, then by punishing them, you're adding another element into their programming to
right,
discourage
right.
recidivism. You're also
Mm,
demonstrating to the other public, you're adding another element into their algorithms and saying, if you do what this person did, you offend in this way, you break the law in this way, this is the punishment you will suffer. And so it creates a discouraging effect, in net effect, not necessarily for specific individuals, because again we come back to the crimes of passion, which are definitionally irrational. A person doesn't
mm,
think about it when they do one of those.
right.
So there are limits, but even if there is no free will, it's still effective because it puts another
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
logic gate on the decision-making process.
right. And so maybe we're looking at it too individualistically. Like, for instance, if a cell malfunctions, there are other functions in the body to break it down and make sure it's behaving, it's performing to what it should be doing. Um, that it may be that these responses we have for saying, hey, that is your punishment, or you are to blame for this, is actually entirely warranted, that individual is not doing what they ought to be doing, as far as in a collective sense, that just like if one cell breaks down in your body, it has to be reined in, or else, it forms a cancer kind of thing. Maybe that is also true for human society when viewed as a biological organism, that we have these functions in order to stop individuals from performing in a way that's going to destroy the collective sort of, to use an organism. I know that the human society is not an organism. I know that. I'm just using it as an analogy.
Well, I think it's a good one because, one of the things that I like about the concept of sociology, anthropology from that perspective, is that you really can look at the function of a given civilization as if it were a single entity. And,
Right.
you've got the conscious decisions of the public, voting, representatives, policies backed, and so on and so forth. Effectively work like a decision-making process in a single individual. But then you've also got automatic responses, autonomic responses.
Right.
The crime and punishment system, flawed, very flawed as it is, because humans keep tinkering with it and it's susceptible to corruption and all kinds of error.
Yeah.
But it does sort of function kind of like an immune system, in that when a cell goes bad, in theory, the antibodies of the law and justice processes deal with it so that it doesn't get out of control and spread. Again, in theory, because there's so many layers of fucked upness about our actual justice system.
It's interesting.
Of free will doesn't doom you to break bad, not if you've been educated about the roots of where our behavior comes from. I agree with that, with everything, except you're taking on the definition of free will as being incompatible with determinism, but it's not. That's what compatibilists say. We say, no, you don't need indeterminism. What you do need is chaos. You do need that squishy, messy, impossible to predict goings on in your neocortex and elsewhere in your brain, because we have to be a little bit unpredictable. We have to keep our counsel. We don't.
Okay, so here's the thing. Okay, so here's what a lot of the time the misunderstanding really is, and I kind of touched on this with Booba Sweat in the chat, but I'm gonna sort of go through it a bit more. The difference between random and pseudo random, right? So people will say, hey, I'll generate a random number with this computer. You're not generating a random number. It's a pseudo random function. So what the computer will actually do, and how most random algorithms work, it will take something like, for instance, how many seconds through the minute or nanoseconds through the minute it is, or how many files are in this certain section of the computer, or the registry, like how the memory of the registry is currently arranged, or like it's just a whole bunch of numbers drawn from sources, and it will run through a complex algorithm that will produce like a mathematical function that will produce a number that, for all intents and purposes, it's random, right? Like if you take the seconds and then the current last memory address of the RAM and divide it by this, and then do a square, and then basically do a calculation on it, it will come up with a number that will never be the same number consistently. However, it's not random. It's based upon numbers drawn from certain places and a calculation that makes it appear random, but it's not random. We can't do random numbers on a computer.
Yeah, and one could argue, like we mentioned earlier, it's possible that there is no such thing as random in reality.
Right.
And I don't even know that it's possible for a thing to even be random, like to take it a step back. Like if I ask my computer or anything else for a random number, well, I mean, it might give me a number between 1 and 10. It might give me a number between 1 and 100. It might get whatever. There's going to be a range on it. For it to be truly random, we can't even have that range. It has to be able to be literally anything. It could spit out kumquat. That would be pretty damn random. So anytime you limit a set, you might want a random number between 1 and 100, but by limiting it, you've already made it not random.
Yeah, and so Booba Sweat, you sort of, when you say you're saying probability is an essential part of randomness. I don't think that's true, because I can flip a coin and it's random. We call it random on what it will land on, but we know that there's impacts on that coin. Like, so the force that it sent up, the height that it goes to, the amount of times it flips, all of the atoms working out. We know that's not actually random. And we know this because through billions and billions of coin tosses, tails is slightly preferred to choose because of the weight of the average coin. It will actually land on tails 50.0000000 something 1% of the time. Like, it's slightly, ever so slightly towards tails, that it's got more probability. And that's because of the way that the heads has got something on it, and the tails has usually got a picture, and the head is a solid block, and the tails is usually has more. So it's more weighted toward the head, which means that it'll land on the head more, ever so slightly. Like, to all intents and purposes, it's random, but it's not. It's not random. We call it random. It's not. And I use this thing. If you're an experienced, like, D&D player, like very experienced, you will know there's certain ways to roll the dice to influence the probability of getting the number that you want. It's not a huge influence, right? It's not a huge influence, but there's ways to do it. And I've done it myself when I'm feeling particularly like this roll really counts. Essentially, what you do is, like, you can put backspin on the dice, for instance. You put the thumb over the 20 and you put backspin on it, so it, goes, and you can influence that. Now, you probably can't influence it completely because nobody has that control, that amount of control, but it is there.
Mm-hmm. That's why pro gamblers back in the day used to have someone blow on the dice, because even though it's a very, very, very slight change, heating up one side effectively changes the density and very slightly weights the dice. It won't guarantee you're going to get 7 or boxcars or whatever, but it'll increase the odds just a little bit. And when you're up against the house with their just a little bit % chance of an edge, that can help.
Oh, is that why they do it? I thought it was to blow any dust or grime that might affect the outcome off of it. That's what I thought.
There's a few different possibilities. Some people have said, "Oh, it's just for luck," but I mean, I've used that trick myself. When you hold the dice in your hand so that you're heating up one side more than the other, it's a bunch of tiny, tiny little things that. It's superstition more than actual physical effect.
Well, that's true. Yeah,
but
yeah, but if you're rolling because you may look at it. Hey, this will not affect. This may affect 0.1% of my dice rolls in D&D. But when you're a really experienced player and you're doing hundreds of rolls per session, that makes a tiny difference. Like, it's just that tiny difference that makes it. And so you see people that have been playing D&D a long time, it's like they're incredibly lucky kind of thing. They're really, really lucky. And it's like, it might not be entirely luck. Might not.
Well, it's definitely not entirely luck. I mean, I have a giant bag of dice over yonder, but then I've also got my actual gaming dice. And there's you're going to have a couple 20-siders because you use those a lot in D&D, and you're going to have some that tend to come out 19, 20, 18 on the higher end, and you're going to have others that tend to come out 1, 2, and 3 more often than others. It's not because of any actual randomness or mystical influence or whatever. It's because there's probably an imperfection somewhere in the die, somewhere towards the core perhaps, that changes the weight and makes it more likely to come up that way. And so you save those dice and set them aside for when you really need a 20.
And then the dungeon master like really screws you up by saying, make a wisdom check, and the best outcome is to fail it, which is just hilarious to me.
What screws me up is when the DM borrows my dice for his rolls.
Oh no!
I'm like, hey, look, shit, I'm dead.
I don't touch another person's dice. All right, I think that's way out of line. That is just bad etiquette, quite frankly. I think you should ask permission. You should say, "May I borrow your dice?" But I wouldn't trust any DM that didn't have his own dice or her own dice. I wouldn't trust them, quite frankly. Maybe they forgot them. Have I forgotten my dice? I think so, once or twice, I guess.
It's the main reason I bring a bag, so that there's plenty of dice for everybody, and so people don't have to touch like my main dice.
I don't know. Maybe that's just me, because I really don't mind it when people borrow my dice. It really doesn't worry me, but I don't like to borrow other people's dice. I like mine. Is that an autistic thing? Maybe.
I'm just possible. Thinking about... Then there's also the fancy dice. Like I don't know about in Australia, but here, like at the Comic-Con I run, we frequently have multiple people apply to be dice vendors because they've got those metal dice with the brass on the outside and the deep blue on the inside and the different patterns. There's the cyberpunk futuristic looking ones, and
they're very pretty.
I don't even play D&D much anymore. Like it's been years, and I want those dice.
It's too time intensive, to be honest with you. It's really time intensive. Like doing a campaign and setting it up. Writing campaigns. Anyway, and the thing that irritates me most is a dice that's really pretty and like you love it, and it's really hard to see the numbers on it. It's like, I love it, but it's hard to read.
I've got some of my dad's dice from when he was young and played D&D a lot, and they're a nice, pretty shade of paisley blue, and they've got a little marble swirling in them, but they're so fucking old. The paint inside the numbers has worn off, and you almost have to feel them to see what the number is.
Don't want to be controlled by others. The whole key to free will is, yes, you're not responsible for becoming a free-willed, responsible person. But once you become one, you now have the talent to resist being turned into a puppet. You can maintain your autonomy in the face of other influences. Now, not always, but at least you should try. And you do. And I really admire the honesty of your book. You acknowledge a lot of your own mental imbalances that bother you. And I'm saying, you already agree with me that free will of the sort that I'm talking about.
You already agree with me. You have no choice. It's determined.
Yes.
Wow.
Is a desirable thing. It's what you strive for, and what, to a very great degree, you achieve. You say at one point, first, it isn't free will and responsibility just because on the social level everyone says it is. That's the central point of the book. And I'm saying that sentence reveals that you have bought the pathetic line of those incompatibilist philosophers who insist that free will depends on indeterminism. It doesn't. It depends on randomness. Let me put a question to you. Does evolution depend?
I agree with that. It does depend on randomness. Yes. But is there anything random? That's the question.
On indeterminism or on randomness, like a coin flip. Coin flips aren't random,
right?
They're just not controllable. They're determined. They're just not.
We're predicting a lot of these things these guys say.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's predetermined.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because we thought that coin flips were exactly 50-50, but we've sort of since learnt they're not exactly 50-50 from doing, like, somebody flipped an insane amount of coins, like just sat there for years flipping coins. I don't know how you have the patience for that. 1 second. It's like in the billions, I think.
Oh, he's got to have like a machine coin flipper or something. In fact, you'd have to have one to make sure you get exactly the same pressure on the coin every time.
No, maybe.
Grayson's got a robot that
Yeah,
always
Carl
flips
Pearson
heads.
tossed a coin 24,000 times. Yeah, and got a proportion of 0.5005. 24,000 times, jeez. Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea.
It also depends on how the coin lands. Like, if you're catching it, it's always going to be heads or tails. But if you're flipping it so that it hits the table, every once in a great while, it'll just land on edge and stay there. So that's a non-binary
Not quite
result.
No, you're right, Robin. Yeah.
But because if you catch it in your hand, so it's always heads or tails, you're removing that weird anomalous possible outcome.
Yeah.
Controllable generation of diversity. But that doesn't, you can't prove indeterminism by citing natural selection as your proof, because natural selection works fine with deterministic chaos.
So I think we've got to differentiate here chaos versus random, because chaos isn't necessarily random. It just appears so.
Well, I guess it depends on what we mean by chaos. Like, if you're using chaos in the sense of information, then by definition, it may not be random, but unpredictable.
I mean in the real world kind of thing, like chaotic systems like weather and Brownian motion and things like that. Chaotic systems.
But as discussed earlier, those aren't actually chaotic. It's just the patterns are so convoluted that we humans don't have a way to describe them adequately.
They're literally described under chaos theory. You know, like that chaos isn't random.
Well, in that case, yes, but that's that kind of application, that version of chaos. It's kind of related to quantum theory in a sense, because it's a way of probabilitizing a system where we don't have a full understanding of all the underlying rules. So we say we can't predict what's going to happen with our current understanding, but what we can do is create a statistical model of what's likely to happen based on certain large-scale variables. So yeah, it's kind of the same thing.
But that statistical model, like if you're saying, hey, because there's all these probabilities, like sort of so we can have a probabilistic model of how the weather's going to turn out, just because it's a probabilistic model doesn't mean that it's random. Like, it's a reification fallacy. You're applying the map to the place. You're reading the map, not the actual thing itself. And the fact that it is probabilistic, that we can say, hey, X amount of times it comes out as this and X amount of time, that shows that it is not actually random. Because does it show that it's not random?
I dare say. I mean, again, we can't say for sure until we know all the different factors that are involved.
Right. That's true.
It seems like there's no reason to think that it is that way. But I don't know. On other random possibilities, Since he mentioned natural selection, what popped into my head was mutations. Like, in an evolutionary sense, we refer to those as random, but are
Right.
they actually random? I mean, they're certainly not deterministic insofar as there's any intention, for lack of a better term. I know,
Yeah.
DNA replication, there's no mind guiding it.
Right,
But,
right.
There's
But
no
those
mechanism, there's no machinery within the cell that's deliberately doing that. It is an
right.
accident.
In fact, it's trying not to.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so intrinsically related to evolution that in order for us to be here, it kind of had to happen, right?
Mm-hmm. Which indicates that there is we know the earliest organisms reproduced asexually, so there
Yeah.
must be some kind of survival advantage,
Right.
an advantage in imperfect replication.
Well, that mutation is responsible for adaptation. It's responsible for speciation. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we know there's a massive survival advantage to the DNA changing. That is the survival advantage of survival advantages, being able to adapt to your environment. That is the thing that is the most powerful. But is it random, or are those mutations part of physics in the way that the cells are working and highly dependent on the physical parameters that have gone into it? A determinist would say yes, all of that is based upon
Yeah.
how the
They're
cell is
designed,
replicating.
for lack of a better term. I
I
know
hate
we're
that
throwing
word.
a lot of
I
anthropomorphization on here.
hate that word. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, evolution has honed them to be that way.
Right.
But I guess it kind of goes back to Half-Lives again. Like, just because the potential is there, when it actually happens, it's not deterministic as far as we can determine.
As far as we can tell, but that's as far as we can tell, though. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
It's like we can't predict when a mutation will occur, what gene or allele it will happen in, because it literally is an accident. The system has evolved to make those accidents happen, but it's still an accident, and so by definition can't be predicted.
Yeah, but if you have a machine and a grain of sand gets into it, and it breaks down, you would say, "Hey, that's an accident as well." But we know that that isn't a random thing that happened. We know that, hey, it's the forces of friction with dirt getting into the rotor, and this happened. Like that's an accident, but it's not random. It seems to me that through talking about this later, it seems to me we apply random to anything that we lack the ability to get a breakdown of the actual parameters that caused it to happen.
So it's this, in a way, it's functionally identical to God of the Gaps. It's, we don't fully understand, therefore it's God. We don't fully understand, therefore it's random.
Therefore it's random, right? And it's like, people that say, hey, a computer produced a completely random number. They just don't know what went into the algorithm to produce that number. It's not actually random. There's a reason why in coding we use the word pseudo-random.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess my sort of computer trained brain is sort of going, is everything pseudo-random?
I think so. I can't prove it, though.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, how do we prove that? Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Robert, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, very briefly. this is your two-stage model, Dan, which is stage one is a generation of randomness, a chaoticism that bubbles up all sorts of options for behavior. And as you point out, filtering out the nonsense, what should I do next? Bark like a dog, that's probably not very viable, a reasonable number of them. And then stage two, you choose. You choose, you weigh them, you reflect all of that, and you choose which of those options you do. And all that does is take us back to where I started. How did you wind up being the sort of person where that's the choice you would make? That's the values that you have, that's the thing.
Yeah, this is what irritates me. You can't, we don't know. So you can always say, hey, it was the previous choices that you did. It was the previous epigenetics. It was the previous, this is what frustrates me about determinists. You go, well, what were they? I don't know, but they were something, like it's sort of, and I've had these conversations where people are sort of like, oh, well, it was all the decisions beforehand that led you to that, but you can't point to them. And, somebody who we can say statistically, they should grow up to be in a certain way. Like just say you get someone from the hood that has been in and out of jails all their life. And suddenly, in their 20s, they reform and have a good, worthwhile life that, is law abiding. Like, how can that happen if everything we know says that shouldn't? That if we are products of our environment and our genetics and all of these different factors, how does that happen? I don't know. But the determinist will say, well, it was something that happened to them.
Yeah, that's it. God did it. It's the same thing. There must be something. Yeah. If you can't point to the thing, if you can't even model a mechanism, then we've just jumped right off the edge of science. We're in something else now.
Right.
Considered to be most important. That's the same issue again. You did not choose to become the sort of person who would make that choice at that point. It's absolutely a choice at that point. And yes, I agree with your sort of chaoticism of generating options, doing a couple of filterings. Richard Dawkins has done fascinating stuff on how we filter out the nonsense of options and algorithms for doing that.
Yeah, so here's the thing. Richard Dawkins, I've met creationists who are like, well, Richard Dawkins hasn't produced any papers or done anything worthwhile. That is absolutely untrue. He's not a counter-apologist. He's an evolutionary biologist. He has published that many papers it would make your head spin. I don't like the guy, but you cannot fault his scientific credentials. I'm really sorry to all those creationists out there, but he is a scientist that has done very notable work. And he's a bit of an ass. Well, he's a lot of an ass, but,
Oh, yes.
Yeah, he is a scientist. Don't mix it up. Like someone's like, oh, has he even produced any papers? Of course he's produced papers. Wow.
Focusing on the reasonable stuff. And then the sort of person that circumstances outside your control have made you chooses among the options. We're back to where I started. Absolutely.
Well, Robert, you and I are who we are because of that whole long history that goes back to the birth of life. But one of the wonderful things about what civilization has managed to do is to create a perspective where that doesn't matter all that much. And where, because of education, because of all the research that you and your colleagues do, we've learned how to address and counteract a lot of the effects. And where we can't counteract them, we excuse people. Some people don't have free will, but many people do have free will that they get because they have been fortunate enough they weren't responsible for this, but they were lucky enough to get treated for the conditions that maladapted their brains for citizenship. And I agree with you. We should do a lot more. You say at one point in your book, we've got to have education. We've got to teach people what the real sources of a lot of these motivations are. And we are doing it, and we have been doing it. And that's what free will is. And it's only because we can do that we can treat one group of human beings, not the young children, not the senile, not the brain damaged, as capable of taking responsibility for the judgments they make. And we hold them responsible, and they hold themselves responsible. And as I've said at one point,
That's why we can hold them responsible. What does
It sounds circular.
it does? They're responsible because they have free will, and they have free will because they're responsible.
Yeah, I declare that everything worn on the feet is a shoe. You have shoes on your feet. I can tell because there are things on your feet, and I've declared that all the things on feet are shoes.
Right.
You may call them socks, you may call them sandals, but definitionally, they are shoes.
Yeah.
Therefore, everything is shoes. It's a tricky one, but I
Yeah.
don't think it's that tricky. Like, so free will, like random numbers, is limited. Like there are parameters beyond which we cannot choose. Like a parent cannot choose to create an offspring with a brain such that the good doctor here would say that being has free will. It's biologically deterministic. Either that being grows up to have free will or falls into one of those unfortunately described deficient categories where he would say that person does not. And that's not within the parent's control. So that's not a thing they can have free will about. And if there are limits on the things that you can have free will about, then it's not really free. Even if there's a range of selectable options, it's still prescribed. Like, I might say to you, you can have your choice of any number of ice cream cones as long as it's between 3 and 5. It's your choice, though. It's not really a choice, though.
Well, it's not a completely free choice. It's not like, but I don't see any choice that is completely free of parameters. Like you've sort of said, it's like going, well, you can choose anywhere to go for dinner, but you can't go to Mars. Like I don't see any choice as being completely free, like outside of you can choose anything you want.
Right. So it's internally deterministic and externally deterministic.
Right.
Now, there's probably mechanisms whereby, because there's a survival advantage in being able to apply rational thought to a given situation instead of just reacting on gut instinct, that have enabled us to create through our creative process also an evolutionary advantage because of this very reason, instead of only going with the running an algorithm and saying this is the most likely thing we should do or the most profitable thing we should do. We can generate a list of options and then weigh the pros and cons in our decision-making process. But it's all just a tapestry of interweaving determinisms that create this emergent property that we call free will.
Well, that's
but
what
not a single piece of it is free.
Yeah.
The ideal system of punishment, and I'm glad you agree with me that punishment is a necessity. You can't have a civilization without punishment, without law and order.
Yes, you can.
I think you can have rehabilitation instead of punishment. I think you can, like you said, you can treat the problem as an error and sort of say we're going to correct this person, not sort of punitively punish them for something. I think you can have a society with that occurring. So
I personally believe you can have a functional society that's entirely anarchistic. There will definitely be people who choose the parasite route instead of acting with goodwill.
What kind of anarchy are we talking about? Because anarchy is often very misunderstood. So anarchy just means a lack of executive, right? So you may still have legislative, you may still have police, you may still have all of this kind of stuff, judicial. It just means a lack of government.
Okay, I mean the more colloquial sense. No laws.
Okay. No laws.
Exactly, which would make a system of crime and punishment completely impossible.
Do you think a society could function with no laws?
In theory, yes. With
I
real humans, that's a harder thing.
Oh, well, I mean, but basically that theory would have to include people acting in a moral way towards one another. And I mean, yes, if that's the case, I would agree, but that's never going to happen and has never happened in the history of humanity. I don't understand why you would put that into a theoretical model.
I think it's possible. It's a hell of a stretch goal, but I think it's possible that if you have people who believe in the benefits of acting with morality, ethics, and goodwill towards each other, acting in good faith generally, and you create an educational system that helps raise the next generation with those same values, that there's still going to be people who are predisposed to suck and will try to be parasites on the system and take advantage of others. But as long as that percentage is low enough, the civilization could function.
Yeah, I don't think it could. I don't think so. I think that there are going to be people who are sociopathic. I think there's going to be people who are psychopathic. I think there's going to be people who will not be able to function in this society and will take actions in order to collapse the society, or not in order to, but rather they will take actions for their own benefit that will collapse the society. I don't think that could even function, Ember. Honestly, I think that even in theory,
perhaps
things are not that simple. Maybe I have a more pessimistic view of humans than you do, but I think
I think you're more realistic. Like many people in the chat have mentioned a few things: Native American tribes, troops of monkeys, other primates, so on and so forth. We see there are functional, not really civilizations in the case of the primates, but every one of those examples, they practice banishment. If somebody is too bad an offender, they kick him out of the troop of baboons, or they kick him out of the tribe, or whatever the case may be. So even if there's no formal laws, there's always some kind of punishment mechanism for the parasitical types.
Yeah, and Titan's just pointing out, in a society without laws, psychopaths would be expelled or unalived by consensus. Yeah, and what will their relatives do? This is what I mean about the breakdown of society, because if you start taking these stringent actions towards these people, their relatives are going to be upset, take actions, and then you're looking at just absolute anarchy, to put it frankly. Look, at one point I thought maybe syndico anarchy would work. So when you're looking at the government and governments in general and states, there's three branches of the government essentially. There's the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. Now, the judicial is the police and courts, the legislative is the houses of government that make laws, and the executive is the one that runs them. So anarchy, technically it means no executive, right? So you could still have a legislature that makes laws and a judicial which enforces those laws without the executive, right? Without the day-to-day state, sort of the government running everything that is handling all of this stuff. And most famously, Ireland a while ago did it with syndico anarchy. It was basically that you, instead of voting for a candidate that became president, you would vote for you'd be in a syndicate, right? That syndicate would, depending on the amount of people in it, would have seats in the legislative or the houses that would decide laws, basically. So if everybody got angry at a syndicate, they'd all leave it. It would lose its seats immediately, and they wouldn't be able to change the laws. They would join another one, and that syndicate would gain seats and get more influence over how the laws were doing. But it had no government as such, no sort of prime minister, president, whatever is the head of state, as well as their cabinet, ministers for stuff. It would just create the laws. The problem with that is that it's incredibly slow to do anything. Like if you don't have a centralized government, like the federal government, for instance, it's insanely slow to get anything done. Like you have to have, in order to respond quickly to anything, whether that be a natural disaster or whether that be some kind of threat from outside, you have to have a government there in order to react to it, in order to say, hey, these resources are going here. Because if you have to make laws every time you are going to respond to a flood, for instance, or put money towards, helping out in this case, then things just break down because it takes too long to react, especially in the size of countries we have at the moment. So I used to think that anarchy could work. I think that in theory it could work, not sort of complete anarchy, but rather something like syndico-anarchy or anarcho-communism. Something like that could work in theory, but I think in practice, it just falls down. It really does. It will not work. It's too slow, too unresponsive, too convoluted to get anything done in any kind of time frame that will be useful to anybody.
Yeah,
That's
there's a lot of things like that, sadly. I used to debate with friends in high school about the viability of communism, not Soviet communism, but like the economic communism, not a totalitarian state system, just the economics. And the conclusion that I eventually came to is that while it looks great on paper, once you apply it to actual humans, it falls apart virtually immediately.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of these systems, like communism, I think it looks great on paper. It's fantastic, but I think that it does lead down the road to the party that runs the communist system becoming the apparatus for totalitarianism. I'm really sorry, but that's every time we've implemented communism, that's where it's led. Sorry, but I think it's fantastic in theory. It's terrible when it actually, goes down the path to actual communism. I think that a socialized democracy is way better because then the mass of the people can have that influence over the party, because at the moment, what I'm seeing, I'm like tangents in the chat. I'm getting very distracted, but what we're seeing at the moment is the question is, who do our representatives, who are they accountable to? Because they're accountable to the people they're voted in. Well, yeah, but are they more accountable to their party who puts them up for election in the first place? That's the question. So at least they have some accountability to the people, but in a communist system like Russia, they only have accountability to the party. And that's a problem.
Yeah, but that's the political system is the problem. What breaks down the bridge between those divides is, everybody agrees that everybody should contribute, and then everybody should receive the resources they require in order to continue contributing, and that sounds fair and reasonable. But who makes those determinations? Once you hit that point, and you start investing that determinative power into the state, you already have a dictatorship.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
The ideal situation, the circumstance of punishment, is where you have a system of punishment which is so fair and so non-awful that the person punished says, thanks, I needed that.
Would you mind if I ask a couple of questions? I hope my questions won't be too silly, but Robert, if I could put to you, if I've understood you, are you suggesting that you wrote this book, a big, long, tremendously interesting book? Are you saying that the book was written as the culmination of all the circumstances of your life, that none of your thoughts were, in a sense, willed by you, that the book was written through you by the circumstances of the whole of life and yours?
It was the
It's
Holy
an odd
Spirit.
situation, but I think
It's a good question, though. Like, did you choose to write this book? And is it anything novel, or is it the culmination of your entire life? Like, just leading up, was the book just a output, basically? Maybe it was. It doesn't mean it's any less significant. It might mean it more significant, in fact. But
if all these things truly are deterministic, then with sufficient knowledge of the variables in question, one would be able to predict when a scientist would write a book. And with enough data, they might even be able to predict exactly what the book is going to say, if straight up determinism is the true state of affairs.
Well, yeah, but that would mean the person doing the prediction would have to know probably more about the person and the subject than the person themselves. Like, because we can't, I guess we can predict our own behavior, right? If I was in this set of circumstances, this is what I would do. And some of us are wrong, or most of us are wrong. Like, you want to say, hey, if I was in this certain circumstances, I would grab this and do this. And a lot of the time, you freeze in panic kind of thing. It's, so I'm not even sure we can predict our own behavior, much less anybody else's.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, a long time ago, I wrote a novel. I'd been writing for various news outlets for a while, Yahoo News, San Francisco Chronicle, Chicago Tribune, and so forth. And I was like, I want to write a novel. It was literally a spontaneous, I wanna kind of thing. A day before, I wouldn't have seen it coming. So if I can't predict it, how the hell is anybody else going to predict it?
Yeah.
that's what you're saying. And if you're not saying that, please clear up my misunderstanding.
Oh, that's absolutely the case. And that was my thinking and where I was at even before I became daft from reading philosophers.
It is a very dangerous thing, I can tell you, yeah.
I know this now as a biologist. Yeah, that's the reality. And as Dan alludes to, it produces a tremendous challenge for us. We are biological machines, just like amoeba are, but we are the only biological machines that can know our machineness. And that produces everything from self-reflection to phenomenal neuroses to like denial to everything else on Earth. We're the only ones who are capable of simultaneously saying, wow, that's nice that that person just complimented me on the color of my eyes, while saying that's completely asinine. I had nothing to do with it. Wow. To say that's a great job that you did, that you're now CEO of the company, and recognizing at the same time, I was already born on third base. I had all of the, we're a weird, troubled, foibled species for that reason, because we can know our machineness at the same time that we can fall for the palpability with which we feel as if we are captains of our own fate.
Is it important, though, for our machines to be operating under the... Okay, just say Sapolsky's right? Let's just say he's right. Sapolsky's right. Is it important for the operation of the machine to be fooled into thinking that we're captains of our own fate? Like, is it that if the computer knows that it's a computer, does it suddenly stop working, or not work to the optimum level that it could because it's thinking about how it's a computer?
Well, I could see disadvantages in that respect, because the CPU capacity is limited, and so if it starts diverting cycles into thinking about the nature of its own existence, it has to become less efficient at what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think ultimately it goes back to, since we do it, there has to be something that evolution could select for.
Right.
I suspect it's an unavoidable consequence of consciousness itself, at least consciousness, sapience, the way we experience it.
Mm.
Because self-awareness is one of the things that makes sapience sapience. So there has to be some survival advantage to the sapience, this illusion of selfness within this machine, of a single entity rather than just a council of brain cells collectively making decisions. And I think there are demonstrable survival advantages to having a sense of self, like self-preservation being a big one. Now, we're not the only animals who have that capability, but because of the way our sapience manifests, we're able to think further down the road than a lot of other species. Like, self-preservation causes us to store up food for winter and shit. Now, some animals do it by instinct. Squirrels. But we can apply it in a much broader range of things than just food for the winter.
Right.
So,
like I've often noted. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think things like that collectively are what generate that selectable advantage, or why we should perceive ourselves in a self-aware way. And once you have that, then it's an unavoidable consequence, an entailment, if you will, that we're going to start to question how much of what we do is because we choose it, when really the entire concept of us as individuals is flawed, because it is a generated illusion. The same way our vision is a generated illusion. It's based on real inputs, but the brain is running calculations and then creating a representation. So it is an illusion, even though it's based on real inputs. I think the consciousness is the same thing. It's an illusion for the sake of our computation.
Yes,
and if the consciousness is an illusion, then free will is definitely not real.
Right. No, absolutely. But I think that there's certain things, like, because we're sort of doing almost a naturalistic fallacy. We're doing, well, because we evolved it, then it has to be a good thing. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think that there's a few evolved responses, like the fear response kind of thing, which can, like in today's modern society, has dragged us down some pretty bad roads, that our perception of people's actions triggering a fear response can cause all kinds of behaviors that are very negative to our outcomes of what we want. So I think that just because evolution has dredged up or developed this sense of personal choice and personal self, that it may not be still a good thing to go on believing that if we know it to be false, or know it to be an illusion, I guess I would say.
Well, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. Functionally, it doesn't actually matter, because even if we did find concrete evidence that what we perceive of as ourselves is an illusion, we still need to live in a way as if we were real, because the pain we experience from not feeding ourselves or injuring ourselves because we drive recklessly, that's still real. The suffering we experience because we let our interpersonal relationships go, that's still real. So we still have strong motivation to operate as if these things matter, because they do,
And people still matter. That's the thing. Like, people still matter, and they still matter whether or not there is a free will person there, or someone just going on the deterministic factors that go into their behavior.
And what that winds up meaning is, it's hard to keep that in mind. Keep it in mind for when it really matters, for when you're judging harshly.
Okay, so can I ask you, Dan, a similar question? If I've understood your view, I've read several of your books. I think what you're saying is you agree with Robert that there's this long, the whole of history of life and then all of your particular life. But I think you're also saying that evolution has created within the machine that you are an ability to judge possibilities and choose between them. So you think that there's a part of the machine.
Yes, that's
Okay.
right. That's right.
And Robert doesn't think there is that part of the machine.
No,
Well-
we're in complete agreement there. As part of your machine, you weigh the possibilities and you choose. You generate options through mechanisms that may or may not be dependent on chaoticism, nonlinearity, blah, blah, etc. You generate options and yeah, you choose. But that has nothing to do with whether or not there's free will, because the choice you make reflects the values, tastes, etc., that you had no control over in you becoming the person who you are. It's back to that same thing. Where did that intent come from?
But don't you want to take responsibility for your character and your judgment? And your
Okay.
What you
So-
want.
Instantly, do you want to take no, like what you want has nothing to do with what's true.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can say, hey, I take responsibility for my actions, even though they are like, I don't know what wanting to take responsibility means. Like you kind of either take responsibility or you don't. And here's the thing. You may be, so a lot of the time, I really want to differentiate here between responsibility and culpability, right? So culpability means you're to blame, right? So Robert Sapolsky is basically saying that you're not really to blame. It's all the previous stuff that's happened. But responsibility is the onus on you to do something about it when you take responsibility. Like, for instance, I use this metaphor where I used to work. Like someone would come with a complaint or something is wrong, and you would apologize and you'd take responsibility. You're not to blame. Like if somebody, their internet went out and it's not working and something fell down, it's not your fault that happened. Like you're just a technician working at an internet. Like it's not your fault that happened. And if somebody else did something, somebody else pulled the plug in the wrong way or somebody deleted something, that's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. So I think a lot of the time, these two things are meshed up in one, that people go, oh, well, it's not my responsibility to, help fix racism. Yes, it is. It's everybody's responsibility for that. It's not your fault that racism exists. That's not your fault. It existed long before you were born, but it is your responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility. So we've got to differentiate between blaming somebody for something and expecting them to take actions to rectify it. It's important.
Yeah, it's another one of those Weasley words that can be easily conflated. Like, what do you mean by responsibility? Like, is it your duty to deal with it, or are you responsible in the sense that you caused it, or something else?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Political views and your moral views, don't you identify with them? Don't you think, lucky me, I'm not responsible for having the free will that I have, but I am happy to say that people can trust me, they can reason with me, they can change my mind, I'm open to discussion. That's what free will is. It's not indeterminism. It has nothing to do with indeterminism, any more than evolution has to do with indeterminism.
Okay, which nicely moves us into this moral realm. Don't I want to take responsibility for my actions, my achievements, all of that? Isn't that a good thing? That's a terrible thing, because we have a world in which we think it is okay to treat some people way better than average, including you and me, because of things we had no control over, and to treat other people way worse than average, and then to butter them over with crap about this is a just world in which people get what they deserve. If taking responsibility for your achievements, all of that, leads you to decide that you're entitled, you've earned to have your needs considered more than that of any other person out there, this, in fact, is a terrible outcome. And we run the world on that.
I like that Sapolsky's basically saying that we could do a bit less of people patting them on the back for things that they didn't have a whole load of, like, did you see people failing upwards? Again, I will point to Donald Trump, like failing upwards and then giving themselves a big pat on the back for where they've gotten. Like, it doesn't seem to be that is really justified.
Well, I think he means to apply that, like that's an example of a larger thing. Like, both of these fellas grew up in relative silver spoon territory, compared to the vast majority of the population.
Oh yeah,
and because of those advantages, they went on to access the better schools and gain advanced degrees and build their careers. And in some respect, they are more deserving than many of their peers. But there's a lot of people who may be just as deserving who never had those opportunities. And so that's sort of what he's getting at, that the things you can do are because of the potential that was beyond your control. That you choose to do them. Well, is it really a choice if the initial parameters aren't within your control?
A terrible outcome that we feel as if we have earned our rewards and punishments.
And if you got caught plagiarizing a scientific paper or fudging data, would you take responsibility for that?
Absolutely. In the
Well,
mechanics.
good. So you agree with me. It's a good thing to take responsibility.
In the same way that I can say that right now, I am responsible for the fact that not only is my arm moving, but all the quarks that make up my arm, I have caused to move. Yes, we're getting caught up in the agents are things that cause things to happen. Agents do things, non-agents do not do things. Yes. But this is not the level we're talking about. We're talking about, is this a world where it is okay, not only if you were born in poverty in our wonderfully just nation that you and I share, that you are overwhelmingly likely to remain in poverty in adulthood. If you were born to parents who are upper middle class, you're far more likely to wind up in my classroom at Stanford than in the county prison. All of that, that's the level that we're dealing with. That we look at.
Well, let's deal with
really don't like
here,
that.
We agree. We both.
It plays into that whole fate thing. Like, yes, it's more likely that a person will end up with this fate or that fate or what have you. But he's using the probabilities to substitute for the amalgamation of the individuals. Like, there are people in any given community who will just kind of go with the flow and whatever happens, happens. And then there's other people who will fight tooth and nail to change their circumstance. And if they succeed, it's not just the statistical outcome. A certain number of people are going to try to change their situation and a certain number will succeed. They made a choice to do that. They didn't have to.
But is that choice reliant on their genetics and the way that they developed in the womb and all of this other stuff? That's my problem with determinism. And like you said, it's like God of the gaps. You can just say, well, these priors that we don't know about and we can never discover are why they actually had that impulse to change their circumstance.
Yeah, maybe, but there's still, even if it's based on an impulse, even if the impulse is based on previous factors, it still fucks up Sapolsky's model, because that's not the level. Like he was just saying, the level he's talking on is the social probabilities, the outcomes and whatnot, and that it can allow for a certain percentage who may choose to fight against their circumstance, but just like with Half-Lives, it can't single out which individuals, because there's, well, not so much with Half-Lives, but with individuals, there's that moment of choice, or the underlying drive and determination, the intention, as Robert himself was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
The motives aren't statistical.
No, absolutely not. And it's not random for that person either. There'll be clear, or, you know, I mean, somebody to struggle through that, there will be clear things that got them through it. But is there an element of randomness? Can random things just happen, like you're just picked on the sidewalk for, you know, looking a certain way, so you're given a movie career to start? I don't know. I don't know if that's
Yeah,
random
like,
either.
let's consider a social experiment that somebody did a few years ago in New York City. He took a wallet filled with visible cash and just left it on a New York City sidewalk with a hidden camera across the street, and left it for an hour, and nobody stole it. Well, why? Is it because they assumed it was a trap? Is it because they're all so moral? Is it because they're also afraid of the police? Is it because none of the people who happened to walk through that particular intersection were starving? Like, if all their needs are met, why would they steal a wallet? You know? Well, we don't know. The social experiment doesn't say. Did they
Right.
all make a choice to not take that wallet? Or was it another factor, or a combination of other factors?
Well, we'll never know. There's no way to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
We would-
for
we would-
either of
we
these
would
guys
have
to
to
say
do-
every single person made a choice, or every single person was responding to a certain circumstance, both would be incorrect.
Well, we'd have to do the experiment with controls on it, right? Like, change one thing about it and then use that as a control. Oh man.
I think we should do what we can to improve those conditions. We should do what we can to eliminate poverty, to eliminate child abuse, to eliminate malnutrition. And if we do that, then more and more people will be able to meet the rather minimal criteria for being, you know, responsible enough to have a driver's license. You know, you make a big deal in your book about the gardener at Stanford, whom you see dutifully trimming up around the edges while you're at some commencement ceremony. But I dare say he's an honest man. He's a responsible man. You don't know whether he's thrilled to death to be able to, you know, perhaps bring his family from somewhere, you know, in South America where he was in great difficulties, and now he's in the United States. He's got a job. He's taking care of his family, and he's proud to be an honest man, and he's proud to deserve the salary that Stanford pays him. There are lots of people like that. There are people that from every walk of life who prize their self-control and their free will.
I don't think this is a very compelling argument by Dennett either. Just sort of pointing out, hey, there's people that prize their free will. If free will is an illusion, then big deal. Like, it doesn't actually get to the heart of the matter.
I'm
Yeah,
really glad for his particular word choice, though, because he helped me clear up a completely unrelated thing. As you may be aware, today's premiere video was about every anti-trans argument. But of course, it's not every anti-trans argument. It's just the ones that I was exposed to in the couple of weeks I was collecting the arguments and coming up with answers. And one of the ones that's been posed to me since then is people accusingly saying, you know, you're a trans adult. Why are you fighting so hard to make it possible for kids to transition? Why don't you just leave the kids the hell alone? And, well, I mean, I can explain that, you know, if I had understood what being trans was as a child,
would have been better.
It would have made my life a lot better if I could have done it much earlier. But that's a rather long thing. And the people that engage on those topics are often very not generous at all. What Dan said here was, why do people fight child hunger? That clicked rhetorically, because it's the same thing. Why do people fight child hunger? To lessen the suffering of children. Why do people fight to give children the ability to understand what being trans is and possibly transition if that's a thing they need to do? To
lessen the suffering of children.
Exactly.
No, fantastic. Yeah, no, I totally agree. Like, you're an adult, you're an adult that's hungry. Why are you fighting child hunger?
Yeah, you're not a child.
But
Why combat child hunger? Why combat child illiteracy? Why any of these things?
yeah, why try to have support for autistic children? You're an autistic adult.
Mhm.
What? No, what? Wow.
And that's why we do these, because
Yeah.
agree one side, disagree the other side, whatever. We're constantly being exposed to completely out of the box ideas, and our clever primate synthesist brains will latch onto an idea and put it together with another idea, and something new falls out, and it's magical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just Dan, you were saying, you were saying that you both agree that we should do something about these moral questions. But am I right in thinking that you, Dan, think that you have the free will to say, I'm going to do something about this? Whereas if I've understood you, Robert, you can't say, I'm going to do something about this. The circumstances of your life and prehistory will either mean that you will do something about it or you won't. But you, Robert, are not going to make that choice. You're merely going to observe it.
In effect, yes. But maybe more helpful is to frame sort of the things that both Dan and I would like to accomplish. Dan's is an agenda, God help me for saying a word this verboten these days, but of a liberal, which is to say it's important to remember the edge cases. Brain damage, okay, keep in mind they're a special case and that sort of thing. But for everybody else, we have a realm in which responsibility makes sense. And I would characterize where I'm coming from as one as far, far more radical. What we see when somebody has brain damage is an easy task for us. We can see the thing that robbed them of responsibility. But when we look at everybody else, we have the far harder task of we need to see thousands and thousands of spider web thick cables of the influences that started from the beginning of life until 1 second ago. And it's a hell of a lot harder to see that. And science has made less progress with that. And it's a whole lot easier to look at that complicated scenario and say, this one is not an exception. This is one where we can hold them responsible. That's the limits of what science has told us constitute edge cases. There are no edge cases. There's just ones where the causality is easier to see because it was mostly from one sledgehammer of an influence rather than a gazillion. But it's the same threads that ultimately bind.
Right. So I get what he's saying. Sometimes we can look to it and go, oh, well, that person was abused as a child. They've been in and out of foster homes. And so their motivations are very evident and clear. Whereas somebody else that might do something awful, it might have been all of these different reasons added up, but not just one reason. And he's saying those are the fringe cases where we don't understand the reasoning, rather than we do understand the reasoning is the mainstream normal ones that we see. Like, just say a murderer, for instance, and that, there seems nothing in his past that would cause him to do this kind of thing. It's like, well, Robert Sapolsky, I think he's sort of making an appeal to, well, there is some reasons there, we just don't know what they are. And so again, I got to bring up your example. It's kind of like determinism of the gaps. Like something was determined, but we don't know what it is.
Yeah, and if we have holes that large in the model, you say, oh, there's a reason, but we don't know what it is. Well, then it's fucking useless, isn't it? We can't use I don't know as a functional component of a model. But also, there's a big problem with this statistical assignment of people's life paths and things, because it creates this idea that, people born in Robert's social class, they're probably going to be fine, and they need very little oversight and whatnot. But the people born poor, they're very likely to be criminals. So the police should watch them constantly, because that's where your criminals are coming from. It's determined,
Yeah. Well, I think sort of the problems with statistical data analysis, for one problem is underdeterminism, right? Like, so if you don't, like, if people aren't prosecuted for the white collar crime that's going on, then of course you're going to think that lower class people are the ones committing all the crimes, because the people on Wall Street doing financial crime and maybe some drugs and stuff, they're not the ones being prosecuted. So that skews your results there. The second problem is that I forgot where I was going with this. There was a second problem. What did he just say? He just talked about how you can. Oh, is applying statistics to individuals, right? So, and part of it. I mean, I was talking in chat about sort of racism and things. Like part of it is sort of going, well, he comes from this set of circumstance, so he's got a 75% chance of coming out this way. Let's assume that he will. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mhm.
I think that you can't apply statistics specifically to people and expect any accuracy whatsoever, because that person may be one of the 0.1%. How do you? I've got a real problem with applying statistics to people and not groups. I really do. I don't think that's what he's trying to do, but just his arguments are like, well, groups of people, and it's like, but we're talking about individual decisions. I don't know. I dislike statistics applied to individuals.
Yeah, it just, you can't do it because any exception blows the entire system.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you wouldn't continue to have tests for whether somebody is capable of driving on the highway?
Oh, of course, absolutely.
Well, then you're going to be making those judgments. One thing
that's fine. I think
one thing you ought to consider: how about asking them? How about asking them whether they want to be held responsible or whether they want to be treated as put them in some kind of quarantined lodge and remove from them the capacity to move about in society? I don't want to do that with people. If they want to be out and about and free, I'm all for it, as long as they agree to follow the rules of society, the laws, and behave themselves.
But are you, Robert, saying, well, it's not a matter of whether they agree or not? Whether they were going to agree or not was predetermined.
And predetermined and inculcated into them as to whatever their intuitions are about how the world should or shouldn't work and whether they deserve to be in their place or not. Where we're having this difference is, yes, absolutely, we should recognize that, like, it's bad to have murderers running around on the streets. We need to protect people from that. That seems undeniable. And there are ways of doing that without having to invoke a responsibility. And at the same time, we also want to make sure that we have competent people removing your brain tumor than someone randomly chosen off the street. It is possible to create a world in which we protect people from dangerous things without invoking a medieval sense of responsibility, and to have competent people doing the difficult things.
Well, I don't think it's medieval sense of responsibility. I think he's equating, so he's trying to link in here that at one point we thought that the milk went sour, it had to be a witch kind of thing. We
Yes.
kind of we blamed that person for something that we didn't know how it worked, kind of thing. Or like, I think his analogies were someone had epilepsy, so we blame them for it, some kind of thing. But I think I get where he's going. I really do. That even somebody that seems to have chosen a life of crime, it might not have been chosen, rather the outcomes of their life experiences, kind of thing, like all of their life experiences put together. But I don't know. I don't think that thinking that person had an influence over their own life, that they made decisions that were not determined, is medieval. I don't think that's, sort of calling it medieval is not the same as blaming epilepsy on witchcraft.
without it being an issue of responsibility, and without it being an issue of you are more worthy because you happen to have the skills that allow you to drive a car safely or to take out somebody's glioblastoma.
Well, then we have hardly any disagreement, Robert, because you want to get rid of a medieval notion of responsibility. So do I.
Okay.
So do I.
Yeah, and Dennett picked up on it too. That's a sort of glib way of saying it, yes. But I do agree with Sapolsky when he sort of says, hey, we don't have to sort of have this retributive, punitive justice system. We can do it as part of, hey, this is a malfunctioning person. I kind of think that it lends itself to a very rehabilitative form of justice rather than, you know, the strict punishment we have so far. But it also brings in the question that some people need punishing for the relatives to feel better, and I don't think that's essentially true. But a lot of people do think it true. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
It's always struck me as an excuse. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who do experience relief or a sense of closure or whatever, but yeah, I can't say I've met any. All the families of victims of crime that I've ever encountered as a counselor, as a minister, as a law student, in all kinds of circumstances, they've all said it's great that society's better, I guess, but it doesn't bring my loved one back, you know?
Right. Yeah. And I know from doing debates on the death penalty, statistically, people do not feel better when someone's put to death. You know, again, I'm going to statistics. I think that people feel better when justice has been performed, but I think it is due to that person being removed. Like, so he can't do it to somebody else. I think that's more where the relief comes from. That person is, you know, I don't know. I don't know. It seems to be that people are more comforted by the fact that this person won't be able to inflict that kind of harm on anybody else. But I could be wrong. I've never lost somebody in that way, so I couldn't say for sure.
I'll put some questions from the audience to you both. Would that be all right? We have Logan Polk Smith asks.
Oh, okay.
Why do
so
you
we're going
fear
to
the
questions
adopting
now. I forgot to cut off the questions. I was going to do that at the end, but yeah, it's just some questions coming out from the audience. So I don't think we need to go through that. But more just the meat of that thing. So essentially, the interesting thing about this, I think, is that they both basically almost identically agree. Right? They both are, yes, all of these deterministic factors, all of these factors that go into your decisions, all of these things. It's just Dennett thinks there is a small shred of being able to make a choice between one of these sorted functions and not. So I think that for my money, the more I learn about determinism, the more I don't know. Like, I don't know whether there's determinism or whether there's free will. Like I said, I switched my side about 5 times during this one debate. So
Yes.
I want to again give a big shout out to Robin. I love it. It's an amazing debate, and thank you so much for providing it. You know, Robin is fantastic, and I love things that will make me argue against myself. That is awesome. I think I had problems with what does determinism mean for morality, but I think the way that I'm thinking about it now, it doesn't have a problem any more than what a computer ought to do has a problem. I think it's fine. And I think that if determinism is true, then maybe objective morality is true. But then you've had the problem of what is subjective. Like if your stances, right, if your stances depend on all objective things, like so all of these physical factors that went into it, all of these factors, then what does subjective even mean? Is that a dumb question?
I don't think so. I mean, from a philosophical perspective, we're always asking that question. What does subjective even mean?
Right. I mean, it is stance dependent. It still means something. It's just like that subjective perspective that you had. If determinism is true, there is no other subjective, like, there is no other stance you could have taken. That stance is the only stance you could have taken. So I guess it still is subjective because, you know, objective things can't be false or true. They just are. They're objective things.
Yes. Is this curtain true?
Right, but it means that you only have one stance you could ever have. Like there isn't like, oh well, I could have had this stance or that stance on the question. No, you've only got one stance on things.
Irrationality. A person could be irrational and say, okay, I'll agree that it's not a true false question about this curtain, but it is a fact, not fact thing. And I could point at it, I can touch it, I can do, and a person can say, nope, I still don't believe it. They can be irrational.
Sure. Yeah, that's true.
Is it irrationality? I'm having multiple thoughts all blending together. Perhaps a certain element of irrationality is necessary for consciousness to function to create those generative creative impulses that we use for decision making.
There's a good question. Oh, that's a good question. Is free will irrational, and is that irrationality necessary for the functioning of us? That would be weird.
Yeah.
That would really be weird.
I really enjoy that thought.
Yeah. I really enjoy that thought as well. Because I when people talk about the self, and you mentioned earlier, like, you know, you didn't think that the self kind of exists. I kind of have an issue with what people think of as the self, because I kind of say, well, you know, when you start to go, well, who am I, right? Like, and this goes into sort of self-actualization and you know, understanding yourself, like what makes me me, like how am I me, as opposed to anybody else out there. And I think it is an amalgamation of my experiences and my thoughts and the things that have gone through my brain. And the, you know, I don't think self is this special thing that's unlinked to anything else. I think that a lot of it is who we know and who we talk to and what we talk about and how we consider things and how we interact with the world around us, kind of thing. I think a lot of our self is dependent on that. So there isn't so much of a self as you think there is. And I have to acknowledge that there does seem to be a whole bunch of people with very different reactions to stimuli in my head that say all kinds of random stuff, you know, well, or apparently random stuff. Sapolsky thinks it's not. So, you know, that comes up with all kinds of, you know, for lack of a better word, random noise. Yeah. Oh, and we've got a Left-Handed Jedi member for 4 months. Thank you so much, Left-Handed Jedi. Really appreciate it. Any support is really welcome, and you've been amazing. Oh, is Robin off? You got to drive. Okay. Good night, Robin. Again, thank you so much, Robin. This was a fantastic debate. Like, absolutely, it wasn't more a debate as a discussion. It was just, I suppose there were a few sizzlers thrown in there. Dan Dennett seemed to be especially fiery on this one, but yeah.
Yeah, it was fun to see, but more importantly, it generated lots of interesting thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love it when something provokes me to be able to argue with myself and others, of course, but myself as well. And um yeah. Yeah, I know I'm probably going to be thinking about this one for a while, which is, I'm not complaining about. That's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Um As far as the debate, fantastic, very cordial. Dan Dennett threw in some zingers, which I don't think they were mean spirited or anything like that. I do like Sapolsky. He seems very like I maybe slightly disagree with some of the things that he said, but on the whole, I think he's very intellectual, very well spoken. Both of them work, but we know Dan Dennett's already very intellectual and very well spoken. That's Dan Dennett for you. But I've never seen Sapolsky before, and he was interesting. I think it was a really good conversation. Yeah.
I've only seen him a couple of times. He's given a couple of talks about how neurology intersects with being transgender. He's one of the people who talks on that, and yeah, he's very knowledgeable in every area that he chooses to speak on. I don't always necessarily agree, but his ideas are worth taking seriously, at least.
Does he think that neurology? Because from some of the papers I've read, that we just don't know for sure, but there does suggest there is some kind of correlation between neurology and at least gender dysphoria. I'm not sure about sort of a drive towards transgender, but
it's some of his own research. There's boatloads of research on brains. As you know, human brains are barely sexually dimorphic, but in every single area we've been able to pin down dimorphism. Trans people, before taking any HRT, are anomalous. They're not in the area of their birth gender, and more often than not, they're closer to the gender they're transitioning to, or outright in the same range as the gender they're transitioning to. So Sapolsky's opinion is based on that research and his own, that being transgender is probably some kind of intersex condition that isn't intersex because definitionally intersex has to do with the anatomy rather than the brain.
Neurology,
But yeah, I mean, if not for our own arbitrary definition of which thing is what thing, if we were being reasonable about what we mean by intersex and expanded the definition to include any part of the body that is not obviously one sex or the other, then we probably would call trans people intersex. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing, and a lot more study is required. Everything that I've read, it's like, yes, we think that there's a neurological component, but I wanna sort of be very honest about this and sort of say that they've said they don't know how much, because when you're talking about brains, how much of the brain is genetically based or basically to do with genetics, and how much is it developmental? Because we construct neural pathways as we learn as children, right? So how much of it?
Speaking about earlier,
Right. So how much of it? And they're leaning towards that people who are transgender, their physical brain structure is more like the opposite sex. There is overlap, and it's sort of very hard to tell, but they're leaning towards, hey, it seems like this is a genetic thing that they're born with. Like, they're just born this way. But we don't know for sure. And this is where we need to do research, not just pretend people don't exist. Like, it needs to be researched. I don't understand why so much research is being shut down, because we're afraid of people. It's really, really weird. Well, I mean, it's weird. We wouldn't go, hey, we don't know why people are, sociopaths, for instance. let's shut down the research.
Mm-hmm.
I,
Like, how are we going to
what
answer that question without more research?
Well, it's like, I mean, I hate to bring it up again, the gun debate, where they're basically like, yeah, we don't know why America has so much gun violence. Let's shut down the research on it.
Yeah,
Terrible.
yeah, a
Terrible.
lot of things like that.
Yeah.
But the
yeah,
point
I'm
is that
sorry, I didn't
Sapolsky's a
really
good
mean to
speaker.
bring it up. Right. And I think he comes across as very genuine and honest, I mean, some of the things Dennett said, I didn't agree with. Like he said, do you want there to be free will? And it's like, A, I feel like it doesn't matter what you want, and B, I feel
Mhm.
like it's trap that he's saying, well, if you want free will, then that's a choice kind of thing. Like,
Oh yeah. There was definitely some Hitchens
yeah,
influence shining through there. But yeah,
right.
he used a lot of rhetoric, which in some ways made him more fun to listen to, but in other ways kind of undermined his points.
Yeah. Yeah, but I liked it overall, and I'll be thinking about this one for quite some time. Have you got anything else to add, Ems? Any other points you'd like to bring up?
I think we covered the lion's share of it.
Yeah,
I'm not convinced either way. There are some compelling things to ponder,
sure.
but I don't think we have enough data at this point in our science, our development, to say for sure one way or the other.
Right. I think I've moved, like, because I used to think free will, free will. I absolutely believed in free will. I think I definitely have moved on that position. I think I'm less certain about free will than I used to be. Which now I can say that's possibly not my fault. Just, I'm sorry, I had to throw that one in there. But yeah, I have been moving away from it, especially having seen Alex O'Connor's thing on it. How free will is an illusion, and yeah, I think it. Yeah, I think I have to revisit that and have a bit of a think about it. But it may be something we'll never know, and that's okay. We have to accept there's some things that we'll never know, as much as it irks us, and it's okay that it irks us. It's okay. It's all right. But what have you got coming up, Ems? What are you up to?
Oh, it's a chaotic time, as per usual. I'm
Hmm.
planning my normal Sunday show is going to be an hour earlier this time because by
Okay.
popular demand, I'm covering the entire interview between Ben Shapiro and Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Oh,
Previously, I only did one segment in part of a larger multi-subject show, but people wanted to see the whole thing, so it's been on my list for a bit, and this week we're going to try to do the whole damn thing. And that's why I'm starting an hour earlier so that I can still be done in time for to redirect to Maya's show for Bad Science Sunday. And the next thing I'm sure is happening is Transpositions on Thursday.
mhm.
That's an entirely different channel, The Transpositions, where Bree and Stephanie Helms and Carly Chardonnay and I all do the news and various trans-related topics. Anybody who has interest or questions about trans issues should definitely go check that channel out. Subtle hint. Um, and then, of course, next Saturday will be the next debate review. As everybody knows by now, Mark and I take turns on whose channel. So
Yep.
next week will be on my channel.
Yep.
I don't know what the topic will be yet, but I'll try to find something at least half this interesting.
Yeah, and well, no, it's okay. I don't get me wrong. I love this. I love the questions brought up. I also have a soft spot for a garbage fire upon occasion. So it's all good, and I have complete confidence in your ability to find amazing debates. In fact, yeah, you're probably better at it than me, which is why I have to use Robin to give me these things. Like, because Robin's amazing. But yeah, that's awesome, and yeah, it'll be good. Take a day off choosing one, because I always I always grab one and then think, is it good enough? Is it bad enough? So yeah, that'll be good. So it's good that we've switched, because I've been doing the last I can't even remember how many. Um, we really should get a better system. I don't know what we're doing. but we'll manage. But if you have any suggestions of debates that you like or think that would be great to cover, put them in the comments. We will read them. Trust us, we definitely will read them. Yeah, if you have any suggestions, any even topics, that you'd like to see, we certainly can choose out topics, and look at debates on a topic that you'd like to hear about, or something you'd like to see. So leave it in the comments. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do like and subscribe if you're not already. I hope that you are, but the likes help us so much, and we really appreciate it when people dump a like. So go down the bottom, just hit it on your way out. I will choose something to send it over. I apologize, my outro is a bit long, but hang tight, listen to the music, and it'll be great. Don't forget to be kind to yourself and be kind to each other. I'm looking at you, Titan. Be kind to each other. And I just want to call out Titan. That drives them crazy. Sorry. But yeah, take
in your anus. Titan Uranus.
Thanks, Titan. Yeah, thank you so much, and do take care. Bye-bye.